There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a great house after the last candle has been put out. Not the silence of emptiness. Something richer than that. The silence of walls that have absorbed decades of argument and laughter, of the long, careful negotiations between people who love each other and want different things. You are here now, in that silence. Somewhere in the distance a city is breathing, carriages on cobblestones, the low rumble of a world that never quite stops moving. But here, inside these rooms, the air is still. The furniture sits exactly as it was placed, heavy and patient. Velvet drapes hold the dark. A fortune waits somewhere in the walls. And somewhere 6 women are deciding, or failing to decide, what to do with everything they have been given. Come in, sit down, let the story find you. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Every fortune begins before the woman who inherits it was born. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment, letting it rest gently in the mind the way a heavy coat rests on a hook by the door. The women who inherited great empires, the ones who received the deeds and the ledgers and the keys and the sealed accounts, received all of it from someone who built it according to their own logic, their own fear, their own particular hunger. And the woman who opens her hands to receive that inheritance opens them into something already shaped, already decided, already weighted with the intentions of a person who may be long dead by the time she finally touches it. The Gilded Age of America produced a remarkable number of these inheritances. Not just in the Vanderbilt drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, though those are the ones most people picture when they think of old money. Not just in the Astor hotels or the Carnegie libraries, or the Frick mansion with its quiet courtyard and its cold marble floors. The inheritances we are thinking about tonight were sometimes smaller and always stranger. They came to women who had no particular education in managing them, no training in the strategies of capital, no preparation for the weight of it. They came to women who'd been raised very deliberately to want nothing for themselves. That is the particular cruelty at the centre of this story. To be raised wanting nothing, and then to receive everything. Let's begin with what an inheritance actually is. Not in the legal sense. The wills and the probate proceedings and the court filings we will come to in time, but in the simpler, older sense. What does it feel like, in the body, to inherit something enormous? There is a particular afternoon light in late September that falls across mahogany desks in a way that makes everything look serious and final. The slant of it, the dust moving slowly through it. A woman sitting across from a lawyer in that kind of light might feel the air in the room pressing differently against her skin. Something has changed. The numbers on the papers in front of her are extraordinary. She has known, in a vague way, that her father was wealthy. She has lived inside the evidence of that wealth her entire life. The rugs, the staff, the particular quality of quiet that only expensive houses possess. But the numbers are different. The numbers make it specific. The numbers make it real in a way that the rugs and the quiet never quite managed. She does not feel rich in that moment. She feels responsible. That is the thing that rarely gets said about inheriting a great fortune. The first feeling is not delight. The first feeling is something closer to the feeling of being handed a sleeping infant by someone who is already walking quickly out of the room, the sudden gravity of it, the awareness that this thing, whatever it is, requires something of you, requires care, requires attention, requires that you not drop it. The women who inherited empires in the decades after the Civil War, and there were more of them than history usually remembers, inherited this feeling along with the properties and the accounts. They inherited the weight before they understood the weight. They were daughters and nieces and granddaughters, and they had been prepared in various ways for various things. Some of them had been prepared well, some of them had been prepared very badly indeed. The badly prepared ones are the ones we remember. Not because they failed, though some of them did fail spectacularly and with a kind of terrible thoroughness that New York society never quite stopped talking about. We remember them because their stories contain something true, something about the relationship between wealth and freedom, between protection and imprisonment, between a father's love and a father's control, something about what happens to a woman when the walls built around her are made of money instead of stone. Tonight we are going to move through several of these lives slowly. We are going to sit with them the way you sit with an old photograph, not looking for dramatic revelations, but letting the details accumulate. The cut of a dress, the particular way a woman holds her hands, the thing her eyes are doing in the moment just before the photograph was taken, when she thought no one was watching. These are the details that tell the truth, not the headlines, not the court records, the quiet things. In the quieter hours of the day, in the late afternoon or the early evening when the light is soft and the house has gone still, the women who inherited empires often sat with their account books and felt something they could not name, something between pride and grief. The empire was theirs. It had come to them through death and legal transfer and the slow mechanical process of inheritance. The buildings stood, the rents arrived, the balance sheets balanced, and yet something about it felt borrowed, felt temporary, felt like wearing someone else's clothes, the seams in the wrong places, the shoulders not quite fitting. We will begin, tonight, in the decade just after the Civil War. America in the 1870s was rebuilding itself in every sense. Not just the physical rebuilding of the South, the slow and often brutal work of reconstruction, though that was happening too and casting long shadows across everything. The whole country was rebuilding its idea of what a fortune meant, what wealth was for, what a man owed to his money and what his money owed to him. The great industrialists were making their names, steel and oil and railroads and the particular American genius for turning resources into power. Men who had come from nothing, or from very little, and who had built themselves into monuments. Carnegie in Pittsburgh, watching his furnaces light the night sky. Rockefeller in Cleveland, understanding before almost anyone else that the real money was not in finding the oil, but in controlling where it went. Vanderbilt, old Commodore Vanderbilt, who had started with a single ferry and ended with the railroads that stitched the country together. These men had daughters. And their daughters, the girls born into the first generation of truly massive American wealth, grew up inside a very specific kind of life. The mansions on Fifth Avenue and the summer cottages at Newport that were not cottages at all, but palaces of 70 rooms. The private tutors, the finishing schools in Europe, the carefully managed seasons of balls and dinners, and the elaborate social machinery of deciding who was acceptable and who was not. The daughters of the Gilded Age grew up as decorative objects and understood this clearly, even if no one ever said it aloud. Their beauty was an asset to be managed. Their marriages were negotiations. Their opinions were, generally speaking, not the point. What happened when those daughters inherited was not always dramatic and not always tragic. Some of them were very capable indeed. Some of them took the money and the buildings and the accounts and managed them with a competence that surprised everyone, including themselves. They hired good lawyers and good managers and learned to read a balance sheet and sat in the same serious afternoon light as their fathers had sat in, doing the same careful work. But some of them, and these are the ones whose stories have a kind of terrible pull to them, the ones who keep drawing us back even now, more than a century later, some of them were undone by it. Not by the money itself. The money was, in the end, just money. Numbers on paper, buildings on streets. It did not have opinions or intentions. It did not want anything. It simply sat there, enormous and patient, waiting to be used or hoarded or argued over or lost. What undid some of them was the inheritance itself, the specific psychological legacy of being raised by someone who believed that the world was hostile, that strangers wanted to steal what was yours, that the only safe relationship was one of control. The men who built the great fortunes of the Gilded Age were, many of them, shaped by very early deprivation. Men who had been poor, or who had been afraid of being poor, or who had watched their own fathers lose everything and had vowed, with a ferocity that never entirely softened, that they would never allow that to happen to themselves. That ferocity is understandable. It is even in its way admirable. It built a country. But it is not an inheritance a daughter can live inside. Think of it like a house that was built for very specific weather, designed for storms, for siege, for the worst that could come. The walls are 3 feet thick. The doors have 7 locks. Every window has bars. The man who built it was proud of it, and rightly so, because it would withstand anything. But his daughter was born inside it, in weather that had been calm for years, and she's never needed bars on her windows, and the 3-foot walls keep out not just the storms but the light, and she cannot remember, after enough years, whether the locks are there to keep things out or to keep her in. That is the inheritance. A house built for fear, handed to someone who had never needed to be afraid. We will return to that image, I think, several times tonight. The house built for fear. It has a particular resonance in the stories we are going to move through together. But first, let us understand the world these women moved through. Let us feel the texture of it, the particular smell of a wealthy Manhattan household in the 1870s, beeswax and coal smoke and the faint ghost of last night's dinner, and underneath everything, the clean cold smell of marble floors that have been washed that morning by someone who rose at 5. Let us hear the sounds, the particular measured tread of a well-trained household staff, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the sound of a carriage on the street below, the way the windows rattle slightly in certain winds off the Hudson. The women in these houses wore their wealth carefully. Nothing too ostentatious, that would be vulgar, and vulgarity was the thing that New York society feared more than poverty. The dresses were expensive but not showy. The jewellery was real but worn only at appropriate occasions. The houses were magnificent, but they were furnished to suggest that magnificence was simply the natural state of things, not an achievement to be displayed. This was the specific aesthetic of old money, or money that wanted to appear old. The studied casualness of those who have had fine things long enough to take them entirely for granted. Beneath this studied casualness was a great deal of anxiety. Always beneath the surface of the Gilded Age there was anxiety. About exposure, about the wrong people finding out the right information, or the right people finding out the wrong information. About the newspapers, which were becoming increasingly interested in the private lives of the very wealthy. About the marriages. Always about the marriages, because marriages were the mechanism by which wealth moved, and wealth that moved in the wrong direction was wealth that might not come back. About the daughters, specifically, who were reaching marriageable age and whose choices, or whose father's choices on their behalf, would determine so much. There is a photograph taken sometime in the 1880s of a group of young women on the steps of a very large house, 7 of them, standing very still in the way that photographs of that era required, wearing their best afternoon dresses, their expressions composed into the formal blankness that was considered appropriate for such occasions. They might be anywhere from 18 to 30. It is difficult to tell. The light is flat. The photographer has arranged them with careful attention to height. What you notice, looking at it long enough, is their hands. Most of them have their hands folded in their laps or clasped in front of them, controlled, contained, demonstrating nothing. But one of them, the second from the left, has her hands slightly open at her sides. A small thing, barely noticeable. But in the context of all that careful stillness, it reads as something, a small resistance or a small hope, something that has not yet been folded. Those hands, those slightly open hands, that is what we are looking for tonight. Not the fortunes, not the scandals, though the scandals will come because they always come when women are given things they were not taught how to hold. But those hands, the small human gesture inside the enormous historical fact, the woman before the inheritance, the woman who existed before she became defined by what she had been given. We will find her in several places over the next hours. We will sit with her in the afternoon light in the heavy rooms with the ledgers on the desk and the account books stacked beside them. We will watch her understand slowly and then all at once the thing she has inherited, and we will watch what she does with it, or what she cannot bring herself to do, which is sometimes the more important story. But not yet. For now, let the image of those hands rest in your mind, the second from the left, her hands slightly open, the photograph a little faded at the edges. The house is quiet around you, the street outside has gone still. Let the weight of the story settle gently, the way snow settles, without urgency, without destination, just accumulating, slowly making the familiar landscape new. The night is long, the story is patient, the rooms are waiting. There is something else worth noting about that imagined photograph before we move on, something about the house itself, the background behind the row of carefully posed young women. It is a house that announces its own importance, the columns, the ornamental stonework above the windows, the entrance, wider than an entrance needs to be, all of it designed to produce, in the person approaching, a specific physical experience of the scale of the wealth behind those walls. Houses like this were built to be seen from the outside, to be approached. What the architects did not design for, because it was not their brief, was how it felt to live inside. To be not the visitor approaching with appropriate awe, but the inhabitant moving through the grand rooms on an ordinary Wednesday morning in February, when the light is flat and the air is cold, and the house is making the particular sounds that houses make when the staff is not yet fully awake and the day has not yet organised itself into performance. On that kind of morning, the grandeur is just architecture. The columns are just stone. The oversized windows are just cold glass letting in grey light. And the woman walking through it, carrying perhaps a cup of tea she made herself because the kitchen is not yet running, wearing house shoes instead of the day shoes that the occasion of being visible would require, this woman is just a person in a cold house, early in the morning, before the performance of her life has resumed. Those are the hours history does not usually record. We will try to stay close to those hours tonight. The cup of tea, the house shoes, the grey light through the oversized windows. The woman who inherited everything in the moment before anyone is watching. The specific details of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age are well documented. The amounts, the properties, the transactions, all of it preserved in the ledgers and the legal records and the newspaper accounts that accumulated around these families like sediment around stone. What is less documented, and what we are more interested in tonight, is the interior experience of the people at the centre of these accumulations, the particular texture of daily life inside a great house, the quality of thought available to someone whose entire world has been organised around the management of something too large to fully comprehend. Because that is the thing about enormous wealth. It is, in a genuine sense, incomprehensible. Not because the numbers are mysterious, they are just numbers, but because the human mind was not designed to hold, in any felt and immediate way, the reality of possessing 600 buildings spread across a city of millions. You can know it intellectually. You can read the ledger figure and understand what it represents. But the knowing and the feeling are different, and the gap between them is where so much of the psychological complexity of inherited wealth lives. The women who inherited these fortunes were, by and large, not given the tools to close that gap. They were given the accounts, but not the context. The properties, but not the economics. The responsibility, but not the understanding that would make the responsibility navigable. So they did what people do when they are given something enormous that they do not understand. They either froze, or they acted, or some combination of both, freezing in some respects while acting impulsively in others, the whole thing producing outcomes that were often nothing like what anyone involved had intended. Let the image of the heavy rooms return for a moment. The mahogany, the rugs, the account books on the desk, the afternoon light moving across the floor. A woman sits at the desk. She is not in this moment thinking about the incomprehensibility of the fortune. She is thinking about a specific number on a specific page, a rent figure that does not match the previous month's figure, a discrepancy, small but persistent, that has been bothering her for 3 days. She's running her finger down the column of figures, looking for the source of the discrepancy, and the particular focused quality of her attention in this moment is the same quality of attention that any person brings to a problem they are genuinely trying to solve. This is the humanity inside the legend, not the fortune, not the scandal. The finger moving down the column of figures, the small, entirely relatable act of trying to understand where something went. The room is quiet, the afternoon's passing. Outside, the city continues in its own way, indifferent to the woman and her ledger. The street sounds, carriages, voices, the particular percussion of a city in the 1890s, rise and fall without particular concern for what is happening in the rooms above. The world does not pause for the accounting. But inside, in this specific room, with this specific quality of focused attention, something important is happening. A woman is learning, slowly and by her own effort, how to understand the thing she's been given. Learning in the only way that is genuinely available to her, not through education or preparation, because those were not provided, but through the patient, laborious process of sitting with the numbers until they begin to make sense. This learning will take years. It will not always go well. There will be mistakes, and there will be people who take advantage of the mistakes, and there will be moments when the task seems entirely beyond her. But she is trying, and in the trying she is being in the most practical and unglamorous sense the thing she was never expected to be. herself. There is a particular kind of invisibility that very wealthy women learned in the 19th century. Not the invisibility of poverty, which is brutal and cold and comes from being treated as if you do not matter. This was a different kind, more intentional, more carefully cultivated. The invisibility of women who had been taught that the safest thing a woman of means could be was unseen. If you were unseen, you could not be judged. You could not be coveted, or envied, or targeted. You could not make a wrong step in front of the wrong people. You could not be used, or misused, or misrepresented in the newspapers that were, by the 1880s, increasingly hungry for exactly the kind of story that a wealthy woman's life might provide. The daughters of the very rich learned to make themselves small inside large spaces. It was a specific skill, developed over years, refined by 100 small corrections. The gentle reproof when a comment had been too forthright. The slight coolness that followed a laugh that had been too loud. The slow erosion of spontaneity, the careful trimming of anything that might catch attention. They learned to move through rooms without disrupting them, to speak without claiming too much space, to smile in a way that communicated gracious pleasure without revealing desire. These were not stupid women. That is important to say clearly and to say first. The daughters who learned to disappear were, in many cases, extremely intelligent. They were excellent observers, as people who have learned to be invisible always are. They had read everything their education permitted, which was sometimes a great deal and sometimes very little, depending on the particular household and the particular father. They could manage household accounts with a precision that would have impressed anyone who thought to check. They understood the social architecture of their world, the intricate hierarchies of who was above whom and why, the invisible rules that governed which families could dine with which other families, the particular codes of dress and address and gesture that marked the boundaries of acceptable society. They knew things, they just were not encouraged to do much with what they knew. And then, sometimes a father died. That is the hinge on which these stories turn, the father dying. In the 19th century, when women could not generally own property in their own names without a husband's consent, when the legal apparatus of society was built on the assumption that property would pass from men to men through the intermediary of women's bodies, the death of a patriarch was a seismic event, especially if there were no sons. Without sons, the property had to go somewhere. And that somewhere, more often than people realize, was daughters. The legal and social management of this was elaborate and anxious, because the underlying assumption that women could not be trusted to manage significant wealth collided with the practical reality that someone had to manage it. The compromises were various. Trust arrangements that gave women income but not control. Male relatives appointed as overseers. Lawyers empowered to make decisions that the inheriting woman could not legally contest. The money went to the daughters, but carefully hedged around with restrictions designed to ensure that the daughters could not do anything truly disruptive with it. Unless there were no sons, no male relatives of the right generation, no husbands with the right claim, unless the inheritance was absolute, unconditional, complete. That is when things got interesting. The women who inherited complete and unconditional control of a major fortune were, in the Gilded Age, something genuinely new. Not entirely unprecedented. Wealthy widows had managed estates for centuries, and there were historical examples of women who had handled considerable financial power, but the scale of the new American fortunes was different, and the expectations placed on the daughters who received them were contradictory in ways that previous generations had not quite had to navigate. They were expected to be competent enough to maintain the fortune, but not so confident that they challenged the male financial establishment that had always managed it. They were expected to make good decisions, but to make them quietly, invisibly, without too much evidence of having decided anything. They were expected to be the kind of women their fathers would have recognized and approved of, which meant women who did not call too much attention to themselves, while simultaneously managing enterprises that their fathers had been very visible in building. The contradiction was impossible. Some of them resolved it by hiring men to manage everything and retreating entirely from the management of their affairs. This was socially acceptable and financially often ruinous, because the men they hired were not always honest or competent, and the oversight required to keep them honest and competent was oversight. The women had been trained to believe was not their place to provide. Some of them resolved it by doing everything themselves, quietly and without making a fuss about it, which was exhausting and isolating in the specific way that doing a difficult job while pretending not to do it is always exhausting and isolating. And some of them, the ones whose stories we tell most often, the ones that became cautionary tales and newspaper headlines and dinner party conversation for a generation, some of them could not resolve it at all. They had been handed a thing they had not been prepared for by someone who had shaped it with their own hands, according to a logic that was not theirs, with rules built in that they had not made and could not change. And the weight of it, the impossible weight of managing something enormous while being the kind of woman who had been told all her life that enormity was not for her, sometimes crushed them. Tonight we're going to move through several of these lives, not quickly, there is no rush. The night is long and the stories are layered. Let's begin with what it felt like to be inside one of these households in the years just before the father died, when the fortune was still his and the daughters were still his, and the specific atmosphere of a house, organised around a powerful man's will, had not yet changed. The atmosphere was one of suppression. Not cruelty necessarily, or not always. The very wealthy fathers of the Gilded Age were not all tyrants, though some of them were, and the ones who would tend to dominate the stories. But even the more benevolent among them created households organised around their authority, and the daughters who grew up in those households absorbed, without always being aware of absorbing it, the lesson that authority resided in their fathers and would pass to their husbands and was not, in any meaningful sense, theirs. Imagine a dinner table, long, polished, set for a family that has had good china so long they do not think about the china anymore. The father at the head, a mother perhaps, or an empty chair where the mother used to sit. The daughters arranged along the sides, beautifully dressed, eating carefully, listening. At this table, conversations have a direction. The father sets that direction. He talks about business, about the city, about the day's events as he has processed them. The daughters listen. They may ask a question, carefully chosen, the kind of question that invites further explanation rather than debate. They may make a comment that is an extension of his thought, not a challenge to it. They smile at his jokes. They keep pace with his mood. This is not presented as constraint. It is presented as appropriate deference, as good manners, as the natural order of things. And the daughters, having grown up in this atmosphere since birth, have largely internalized it. Most of the time, they are not even aware of suppressing themselves. The suppression is so deep and so long practiced that it does not feel like suppression. It feels like personality. It feels like who they are. But here is the thing about a suppressed self. It does not disappear. It waits. It accumulates in the quieter places. In the hours after the household has gone to sleep and a daughter sits in her room with a candle and writes in her journal, or does not write but thinks, allowing herself thoughts she would not allow at the dinner table, in the strange dreams that come sometimes, vivid and unsettling, full of movement and colour and a freedom of action that waking life does not provide. In the small, precise moments of reading, a novel that has been approved, something respectable, nothing too exciting, but within its respectable pages a sentence that lands differently than expected, that describes something true about wanting, about the specific ache of a self that has been told it cannot fully exist. The suppressed self waits, and when the father dies and the inheritance arrives, it surfaces. This is what made the Gilded Age daughters so fascinating to the society that watched them, and so frightening to the establishment that had to manage them. The inheritance did not just bring them money, it brought them, for the first time in their lives, the possibility of choice. And the choices they made in the first years after inheriting were often large in proportion to how controlled they had been. Not large in a dramatic theatrical sense, not always. Sometimes the largeness was entirely interior. The woman who had nodded along for 40 years who suddenly one morning put the account book down and decided she would like very simply to take a walk. Just that. A walk. At a time of her own choosing. In a direction no one had approved in advance. Something so small it barely registers as a choice, except that it is, for this particular woman, on this particular morning, the first time in decades she has done exactly what she wanted without consulting anyone. That is one version of what happens when the suppressed self surfaces. Another version is more dramatic. The woman who spent her entire girlhood watching the world from windows, who inherited a fortune large enough to open every door in the city, who looked around at all those doors and chose, with a deliberateness that surprised everyone, including herself, to walk through the ones her father would have considered most scandalous. Not because scandal was the point, but because scandal was the evidence that she was, in fact, now making choices, that the choosing was real and that it was hers. The particular scandals of the Gilded Age heiresses were various. We will come to several of them in the hours ahead, but what is worth noting now in this act before the scandals themselves arrive is the way the scandals looked different depending on where you were standing. From the outside, from the perspective of the society pages and the dinner party conversations and the carefully maintained standards of the families who had known these women since they were girls, the scandals looked like willfulness, like ingratitude, like a failure of the proper female virtues of discretion and self-restraint. The very wealthy men who had built these fortunes had done so, in their minds, partly to provide their daughters with protection from a world that would otherwise be harsh to women without means, and now their daughters, having received that protection, were apparently trying to dismantle it, were behaving as if the protection had been unnecessary, were, in the most generous interpretation, naive about the dangers of the world they were now choosing to engage with. From the inside, from the perspective of the woman making the choice, in the particular morning light of the particular room where she finally decided to do the thing she had been told not to do, the scandal looked like nothing so dramatic. It looked like breathing, like the first full breath after a long time of breathing shallowly. The specific physical sensation of a chest expanding, a posture changing, the body reconfiguring itself around the new fact of its own agency. That gap between how the choice looked from outside and how it felt from inside is where the most interesting part of these stories lives. We have been moving toward it for a while now. Let us stay close to it for a moment. The room is quiet, the city is quiet beyond the windows, the night is giving you permission, as the late hour always does, to follow the slower, more honest rhythms of thought. Think about the woman at the centre of our story. Not any single historical figure, but the composite woman, the woman built from the patterns that repeat across these lives. She grew up in a house organised around her father's will. She learned to want what she was permitted to want, and to want it quietly, and not to want too much. She embroidered and read approved books and poured tea for guests she barely knew, and answered questions about her health and the weather with a composure that never wavered, because wavering was the thing that led to consequences. She was good at it. She was genuinely good at the performance of the self she had been shaped to perform. This is important and often overlooked. The women who eventually scandalized their families and their society were, for long periods of their lives, entirely conforming to its expectations. They were not covertly rebellious from the start. They were, mostly, exactly what they appeared to be, until they were not. The not was always preceded by something, a specific trigger, a specific moment when the gap between the performance and the self became too large to maintain. For some of them, the trigger was the father's death itself, the sudden absence of the organising authority around which the household had always revolved, the silence where his voice used to be, the morning, 3 weeks after the funeral, when she woke at the usual hour and started going through the usual rituals and realised, partway through the second ritual, that there was no one for these rituals to be performed for any more, no one whose approval organised the day, no one to report to. Just herself, in a house full of rooms with a fortune she did not yet know how to hold. For others, the trigger was slower. The gradual accumulation of years lived in a specific way, piling up like the newspapers in the Wendell mansion, until the weight of them made movement impossible. And then, one day, something gave. Not the obvious things, not the will or the resolution or the determination that people like to believe is what drives change. Just something structural, something load-bearing, that had been holding the performance in place and that finally could not hold any more. The thing gave, and the woman stood in the rubble of her own careful management, blinking, uncertain, and more herself than she had been in years. This moment, the blink, the rubble, the sudden exposure, is where the scandals come from. Not from wickedness, not from greed or recklessness or the failure of moral character that the newspapers always found ways to imply, from the irreducible human need to be, in some essential sense, real. The night has deepened. The breathing is slower than it was at the beginning of this act. Let the image of the blink stay with you. The woman in the rubble of her careful management, uncertain and exposed, but finally, fully awake. The city outside has gone quieter. The carriages have thinned. The gas lamps on the street cast their particular gentle pools of yellow light on cobblestones that are wet from the afternoon's rain, still glistening in the late-night stillness. Inside the house, in the room where the account books wait on the desk, the woman is still there, but she's looking out the window now, not at the books, looking out at the wet cobblestones and the yellow light in the empty street. Something has shifted. Something that was tight has loosened. Something that was arranged has come undone. And in the coming undone, in the soft ruin of the careful arrangement, there is something that might, given time and patience and the particular quality of attention the late hour allows, turn out to be possibility. A scandalous choice in the vocabulary of the Gilded Age did not require much. A woman attending an event without a chaperone, a woman speaking to a man to whom she had not been properly introduced, a woman expressing a political opinion at a dinner party in a voice that was not deferential, a woman wearing a colour considered too bold for her age and situation, a woman laughing too freely, walking too quickly, being seen in a part of the city that was not her part of the city. These are small things. They are almost impossibly small, and yet in the context of the world these women inhabited, they carried real consequences, not hypothetical ones, social exclusion, which in that world was genuinely damaging to a woman's life and prospects, newspaper gossip which could redefine a woman's public identity permanently, family rupture, the loss of the specific kind of support that only family provides, which was, for women in that era, often the only support available. The women who had inherited great fortunes were somewhat insulated from the social consequences. Money buys a degree of tolerance that is often mistaken for acceptance. When a woman is rich enough, people find ways to accommodate choices that would ruin a less wealthy woman. They explain it differently. They tell a more forgiving story. She is eccentric, they say. She's spirited. She has always been unconventional. These are the more generous reframings available to women with money. But the fortune itself could be its own kind of scandal. Because a woman with great financial power, without a husband or a father to mediate that power, was something that the social order of the late 19th century did not have a comfortable category for. She was not a wife, with a built-in social role that defined what a wife was allowed to do and want. She was not a widow, with the sympathy and the social protection that widowhood provided. She was not a spinster in the usual sense. The word implied modest means, and her means were anything but modest. And she was not a businesswoman, because that category barely existed yet in the respectable imagination. She was just herself, with money, with power, with the terrifying freedom of someone who has more resources than she has been taught she's allowed to want. What did she do with it? The shape of a scandalous choice for these women varied enormously. Some of them were scandalous in ways that look, from our distance, like courage. The woman who used her fortune to fund causes her father would have opposed. The woman who chose not to marry when every expectation pointed toward marriage. The woman who demanded a seat at the table where decisions were made about her own money. The woman who hired her own lawyers rather than relying on the lawyers who had served her father, who read the documents herself instead of trusting that the men she had employed to read them were doing so honestly. These were not small things. They required real nerve. The resistance they encountered was genuine and sometimes severe. A woman who insisted on reading her own legal documents was told she was being difficult. A woman who hired her own lawyers was told she was being manipulated by those lawyers. A woman who sought to understand her own financial situation was told that she was unsuited to such understanding, that it would only confuse and distress her, that she should trust the people who had always handled these things and let them continue to handle them. The women who pushed back against this resistance were, in a real sense, fighting a battle that most of them had not expected to fight and had not been equipped for. They had the money to fight it, which helped, but they did not always have the knowledge, or the confidence, or the support. And the people arrayed against them, the lawyers, the financial advisors, the distant male relatives with their own claims on the estate, the friends who were not quite friends but who had always managed to be present when the accounts were being reviewed, had decades of practice. Some of the women lost that fight. Some of them won it, and what they won was a kind of freedom that history has not always remembered to record. The freedom of a woman who managed her own fortune competently and quietly, making decisions and living with them, building something or preserving something or giving something away, according to her own judgment. These are not the dramatic stories. They do not end in newspaper headlines or court cases, or the spectacular wreckage that makes for compelling historical anecdote. They end in order, in competence, in the quiet satisfaction of having done something well. They end in women who died knowing they had held the thing together, whatever the thing was. But it is the more dramatic stories we return to, not because the quiet competence is less real or less admirable, because the dramatic stories contain something that the quiet stories do not, something about the specific texture of collision between a self that has been shaped for compliance and a world that has just handed that self something enormous and said, without preparation, without explanation, "Here, this is yours now." The collision between the shaped self and the unexpected inheritance, that is what makes the stories resonate. Let us consider one particular version of this collision. A woman inherits a factory. Not the grand kind of factory, not the steel mills and the blast furnaces that define the industrial heroism of the Gilded Age narrative. Something smaller and older and more personal. A factory that made something useful and dull. Paper perhaps, or cotton goods, or the particular kind of product that keeps a regional economy moving in ways that are entirely invisible until the thing stops being made. This woman has never seen the factory. She has been told about it in the way that daughters were told about their father's business interests. The name of it, the general nature of it, the fact that it was profitable. The details were not considered relevant to her. She was not being groomed to manage a factory. She was being groomed to marry someone who might eventually manage a factory, which is a very different education. And now the father is dead and the will has been read and the factory is hers. She visits it for the first time on a grey morning in November. She is dressed carefully, in the way she was taught to dress carefully for any official occasion, and the care feels slightly absurd as soon as she steps out of the carriage onto the cobblestones of the factory yard. The women who work here are dressed in aprons and work boots. The foreman who comes forward to meet her is a large man in his 50s who has managed this factory for 15 years and who has absolutely no idea what to do with this woman standing in his yard in her good coat and her careful hat. Neither does she. They stand and look at each other across this immense gap of assumption and incomprehension. The foreman sees in her a woman who does not belong here and who will, he hopes, sign whatever needs signing and return to wherever she came from and allow him to continue doing what he has been doing without interference. She sees, in him, a man who knows everything about this place that she does not know, who has managed it for 15 years and considers it, in some important emotional sense, his, and who is watching her with an expression of careful neutrality that she recognizes as politely suppressed contempt. Between them, the factory, the machinery inside it running or quiet depending on the day, the women and men who work it, visible through the windows in their aprons and their boots, the accounts that show the inputs and outputs, the costs and the revenues, the particular arithmetic that turns human labour and raw material into money, money that is now hers. What does she do? This is the question. This specific question, posed in this specific grey morning in November, the cold coming up through the cobblestones. This is the fulcrum on which the rest of her life and the lives of the people inside that factory will balance. She could do what the foreman hopes she will do, sign whatever needs signing, trust that the people who have always managed this have her interests and the interests of the workers at heart, go home to the house with the heavy furniture and the careful rugs, and let things continue as they have always continued. This is the safe choice, the invisible choice, the choice that keeps her in the role she has been trained for. Or she could ask a question. A very simple question, the kind that sounds almost childlike in its directness. How does this work? What happens in there, in those rooms, with those machines, with those people? Where does the raw material come from and where does the finished product go? Who decides how much the workers are paid, and how was that decision made and when was it last revisited? A question asked with genuine curiosity, not with the intention of being difficult. just the honest curiosity of someone trying to understand the thing that has been handed to her. This question, in the context of a Gilded Age factory yard on a grey November morning, is the scandalous choice. Not the question itself, which is entirely reasonable, but the act of asking it, of treating her own inheritance as something that required her understanding, of positioning herself as someone who might have opinions about how the thing she now owned was being run. The foreman does not like the question. He answers it carefully and incompletely and then steers the conversation toward the things that need to be signed. She notices this. She has been trained all her life to notice the subtle moves by which she's being managed, because being managed is a thing she has experienced constantly, and you cannot experience something constantly without developing a very fine sensitivity to its textures. She notices and she does not let it go. This is the beginning of the burning. Not a dramatic burning, not yet, just the small beginning of it. The moment when the trained compliance meets the new reality and does not quite accommodate it. When the woman looks at the thing she has inherited, the factory, the buildings, the accounts, the entire machinery of a fortune that was built by someone else, according to a logic she was not taught, and feels, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what has been given to her. Not just the money, the responsibility, the history, the 1,000 decisions that went into building this thing, the 1,000 lives affected by those decisions, the complexity of it, the moral complexity, the human complexity, the financial complexity. She stands in the factory yard in November with the cold coming up through the cobblestones, and she asks a question, and the question opens a door. This is how empires begin to burn. Not in fire, in questions asked by women who are told all their lives not to ask them, and who have come finally to a place where they cannot stop. There is a particular quality of attention that comes with asking a genuine question. Not the polite, deflecting questions of the well-managed social life. Those questions that are really statements, that are really performances of curiosity rather than curiosity itself. The genuine question is different. It arrives in the body differently. There is a lean toward, a focusing of something. The chest opens slightly. The eyes stop managing their expression and simply look. When the daughters of the Gilded Age stopped managing their expressions and simply looked, what they saw was often genuinely alarming. Not because the world was so very different from what they had imagined. In some ways it was exactly as they had imagined. The same hierarchies, the same arrangements of power, the same basic grammar of how things worked. But seeing it clearly, without the buffer of the managed glance, was different from imagining it. The tenement buildings they owned, seen with their own eyes rather than through the abstractions of the account book, were crowded and cold and inadequate in ways the account book had never needed to specify. The factory workers, seen as people rather than as inputs in a cost calculation, had faces and postures that said things the cost calculation did not contain. The genuine question, asked on the grey November morning in the factory yard, was the beginning of seeing clearly. Some of the women who began to see clearly found this unbearable. They had the option, always readily available, the temptation always present, of managing their vision again, of reinstalling the buffer, of returning to the comfortable abstractions of the account book and allowing the people behind the numbers to become numbers again. Some of them took that option and lived the rest of their lives in the specific comfort of not looking directly at things. But some of them did not. Some of them, having begun to see clearly, found that the seeing could not be undone, that the face in the factory window, the woman in the tenement doorway, the specific human cost of the specific numbers in the account book, these things, once seen, stayed seen. And the staying seen was the beginning of the burning. The night is quiet around you. The city outside has gone very still. The particular peace of the deep hours has settled, the peace that comes when the day's performing has ended, and what is left is only what is genuinely there. Let the factory yard rest in your mind for a moment. The grey morning, the cobblestones, the woman in her good coat and the foreman in his careful neutrality, the factory windows, and behind them, the faces. The question hanging in the cold November air: how does this work? It is a good question. It is in fact one of the most important questions, and it is worth sitting with, even now, even here, even in the gentle dissolving of the late hour into something like sleep. How does this work? Let it rest there, soft and unhurried as the night deepens around it. Giving away a fortune is an act that looks from the outside like a simple thing. The money was there. Now it is not. The properties were owned. Now they are not. The accounts were full. Now they are emptier, organized around an entirely different arithmetic than before. Simple. But from the inside, from the perspective of the woman sitting with the account books and the legal documents, and the awful weight of all that accumulated wealth, giving it away is one of the most complicated acts a human being can undertake. Not because the act itself is complicated, though the mechanics of it can be. Charities to be selected, trusts to be established, lawyers to be navigated, the intricate legal apparatus of wealth redistribution to be engaged. All of that is complicated in its way, but it is the kind of complication that can be solved with enough time and enough competent professional help. It is external complication of process and procedure. The internal complication is harder. The internal complication is the voice that sounds exactly like the person who built the fortune saying, "This is not yours to give away. You received this in trust. You are a custodian, not an owner." A custodian does not give away the thing she has been entrusted to protect. The voice is not imaginary. It was implanted over years of dinners and conversations and the accumulated messages of a childhood spent inside someone else's logic. It was put there deliberately, by people who understood that the most effective way to control a fortune across generations was to ensure that the person receiving it believed, at a deep level, that the fortune was not really theirs to do with as they chose. The women who gave their fortunes away had to fight that voice, and the voice was very good at arguing. Let us begin in New York, in the 1890s, in a house not unlike the one we have been imagining. A woman in her middle years, not yet old, but no longer young in the way that the Gilded Age counted youth. She has inherited a very large sum, properties across the city, investments in the new industries, cash in the accounts of several banks, more money than she can spend in several lifetimes, compounding year by year whether she pays attention to it or not. She has always been drawn to the poorer parts of the city. Not in the way that some wealthy people are drawn to poverty, the philanthropic tourism of the comfortable, visiting the tenements with their notebooks and their horror and their sense of their own generous concern. She has been drawn to the people, to the specific texture of lives lived at the edge of what is sufficient, the extraordinary ingenuity of survival that poverty requires and never receives credit for. She has read the reports. She has spoken to the women who work in the settlement houses. She has, when it was possible to do so without causing too much family embarrassment, visited. What she has seen is the direct output of the fortune she inherited. This is the thing that the account books never say, but that becomes, in time, impossible to unsee. The rents that arrive each month, the rents that fill the accounts and compound in the investments, and pay for the house with the heavy furniture. Those rents come from somewhere. They come from rooms in buildings that her father built or bought, rooms that families live in, rooms that are often small and cold and inadequately maintained, because the maintenance of a building cuts into the rent margin, and the rent margin is the point. She knows this. She's known it for years. But knowing something as an abstract fact and knowing it as a lived reality are different kinds of knowing, and she has spent most of her adult life keeping the two kinds carefully separated. What happens when she can no longer keep them separated? What happens when she walks past a building she owns, in a part of the city she rarely visits, and sees a woman in the doorway, a woman her own age approximately, with children around her, with a particular quality of exhaustion that is not temporary but permanent, the exhaustion of too little and too cold and too hard for too long, and recognizes that the rent this woman pays each month goes into the accounts that allow the house, with the heavy furniture, to continue existing. The connection is not abstract then, it is a face, it is a woman standing in a doorway. The impulse to give is immediate and overwhelming, and from the perspective of the voice in her head, dangerously naive. What would her father say? What would the lawyers say? You cannot simply give away the buildings. You cannot simply zero out the accounts. You have obligations. There are people depending on the income from these properties. Not just the woman in the doorway, but all the tenants, who would need to find new housing if the buildings were sold, and the staff of the house with the heavy furniture, who would need other employment, and the various investments downstream of the central fortune, all of them connected in ways she does not fully understand and has not been equipped to fully understand. This is the genius of the voice. It is always technically correct. The woman in her middle years, standing in her house, fighting with the voice that sounds like her father, knows that the technically correct argument is not the only argument. She knows that the correct technical analysis can be deployed in service of the status quo in ways that make the status quo appear inevitable, required, the only possible option. She knows that every argument she has ever heard for why the fortune cannot be given away has contained, underneath it, the assumed conclusion that the fortune should not be given away, that the conclusion has always preceded the argument, that the arguments are elaborate justifications for a position already taken, not genuine reasoning toward a position. She knows this, and it does not make the arguments easier to refute. So she begins slowly. Not with the buildings, not yet. She begins with a smaller piece, a donation to a settlement house in the neighbourhood where she has been walking. Enough money to run the house for a year without financial anxiety. Enough to hire another staff member. Enough to repair the roof, which is leaking in the same way that buildings leak when they are owned by people who prefer not to spend money on maintenance. The donation is made quietly. She does not want credit. She does not want her name on anything. She has been watching the way wealthy philanthropy works in New York society, the way giving becomes a kind of display, the buildings named for donors, the plaques and the ceremonies and the newspaper mentions, and she wants no part of it. The giving is between her and the accounts, private, personal, her own reckoning with what the accounts represent. But the lawyers find out. Lawyers always find out. The amount is large enough to appear in the records they maintain of her affairs, and they question it with the specific combination of solicitousness and alarm that is their professional register when a client appears to be doing something they consider inadvisable. She hears them out. She thanks them for their concern. She continues. This becomes the pattern. Giving, encountering resistance, continuing. The resistance comes from various directions. The lawyers, the distant relatives who have begun to watch the accounts with proprietary interest, the friends who have always been fond of the house and the dinners and who sense, without quite articulating it, that if the fortune diminishes, the invitations might too. The resistance is constant and creative and never quite admits what it is about. It is never about her happiness, or the happiness of the woman in the doorway. It is always about responsibility, about custodianship, about the importance of preserving what has been built, about the example that would be set if people of means simply began distributing their wealth according to their consciences rather than according to the established structures of charitable giving, which keep the money in the right hands and ensure that it accomplishes the right goals as defined by the right people. She keeps giving. The amounts grow, the buildings begin to go, not the ones where tenants live, those she holds, because she has made a commitment in her mind that the people who live in those buildings will not be displaced by her choices, and she is managing the properties differently now, spending money on maintenance in ways that cut into the margin but make the buildings livable. The empty lots, the commercial buildings, the speculative purchases that her father made hoping they would be worth more in 10 years, those she sells, and the proceeds go into the settlements and the schools and the clinics. The lawyers draft increasingly urgent letters, the relatives hold meetings, the newspapers begin to notice. And this is where the story becomes a scandal. Not in any dramatic or lurid sense. There is no romance, no crime, no sudden rupture. Just a woman, giving away money according to her own judgment and conscience, with no obligation to explain herself to anyone. The scandal in the vocabulary of her world is precisely this, that she has no obligation to explain herself, that the fortune is hers to dispose of as she chooses, that no man, no relative, no lawyer, no institution can stop her. The scandal is the freedom. The giving is the burning. Not all of the women who burned their empires did so through generosity. We should be clear about this. The burning took many forms, and not all of them were noble or particularly coherent. Some of the women spent their fortunes into nothing, through a kind of frantic purchase that looked, from the outside, like joy but felt, from the inside, like panic. The relief of spending mixed with the terror of the voice saying, "This is not yours to spend." Some of them lost their fortunes to the men who managed them, through a combination of their own lack of engagement and the specific kind of financial predation that targets the unprepared. Some of them gave their money away not to causes but to people, to a friend, a companion, sometimes a romantic partner, and the giving was genuine and the taking was genuine and the outcome was sometimes fine and sometimes catastrophic. But the women who gave with clear eyes and specific intention, who took the weight of the inheritance and used it to undo some part of the harm that had generated it, these women left something behind. Not the empire itself, not the buildings or the accounts or the carefully maintained balance sheets. They left a different kind of mark, harder to see in a way because it is the mark of absence rather than presence, the harm that did not happen, the cold that was remedied, the roof that was fixed, the children who went to the school that was funded by money that used to sit in an account accumulating interest for people who did not need it. That kind of mark does not show up in the histories. It does not generate headlines or court cases or the kind of dramatic narrative that gets retold at dinner parties. It shows up, if it shows up at all, in the small persistent facts of slightly less misery. The slightly warmer room, the slightly better fed child, the slightly less broken woman in the doorway. The night is quiet around you. The room has settled into its late-hour stillness. The breathing is slower now, slower than it was at the beginning of the story. The body is remembering how to rest. Let the settlement house rest in your mind for a moment. The fixed roof. The staff who no longer worry about whether the house can pay them next month. The particular quality of air in a room where people are doing good work. Something almost physical about it. Something warm and concentrated. The woman who funded it is not there. She did not want credit. She's back in her house, which has grown quieter as the fortune has grown smaller, the staff reduced, the dinners simpler. She is sitting in a room with less furniture than before. The heavy pieces have been sold, the carpets have gone. There is a pleasant spaciousness to the room that she has come to like, a breathing room in the absence of all that accumulated display. She is reading. Something she chose herself, not something her father approved. Something that describes the world as it is, not as a well-managed household should pretend it is. Through the window the city continues. Somewhere below the settlement house, the children she will never meet, doing the things children do when they are warm and fed. She turns the page. The late hour holds everything gently, the story and the room and the woman and the page she has turned. All of it resting now in the quiet. There is a particular quality to the act of holding on. You can see it in hands, in the white-knuckled grip of someone holding something they cannot afford to lose, or believe they cannot afford to lose, which is in practice the same thing. The knuckles pale, the fingers ache. The thing being held is not going anywhere. It is a deed, a document, a set of keys, a locked box. But the holding is what the body understands. The holding is what feels like safety. The women who held on too long to the empires they inherited held on in this white-knuckled way, not out of greed, though they were often accused of greed, out of something older and simpler, fear. The specific fear of someone who's been taught all her life that the world is dangerous and the fortune is the only protection against that danger, and who cannot quite believe, even when the fortune has become a cage, that the protection is not worth the cost. These women were not foolish. The distinction is important. They were not women who misunderstood their situation. They understood it with a painful clarity. They understood that the fortune had consumed their lives. They understood that the holding was its own kind of loss, the loss of everything you sacrifice to protect the thing you are holding. They understood, at some level, that the accounting was all wrong, that what they were protecting was worth less than what they were sacrificing to protect it. They held on anyway. Because understanding a situation and being free of its grip are different things, because the fear that has been installed in a person from childhood does not dissolve simply because that person has acquired the intellectual equipment to diagnose it. The fear runs deeper than the intellect. It lives in the body, in the particular way the body responds to the thought of the fortune diminishing, or of strangers gaining access to it, or of the elaborate protections being removed and the thing that was being protected exposed to the world's dangerous attention. Let us think about what it felt like from inside that holding. Imagine a woman in her 60s living alone in a large house that was once full and is now quiet. She has been alone in this house for 20 years since her last sister died. The staff is reduced to 2 or 3 people she's known for decades. People whose loyalty she trusts because it has been tested over time and has not broken. The house is maintained in the way that things are maintained when the maintenance is done out of duty rather than love. Everything is clean, everything is in its place, but there is a staleness to it, an absence of the particular freshness that comes from a space that is genuinely lived in. She moves through it carefully. She knows every room, every floorboard, every window frame and door hinge. She knows which drawer sticks in damp weather and which lock needs to be lifted slightly before the key will turn. The house is an extension of her body in the way that very familiar spaces become extensions of the body. She does not have to think about it. She moves through it the way the body moves through breathing, automatically, continuously, without attention. Outside the house, the city is changing. It is always changing. That is the thing she found in the years after inheriting most difficult to accommodate. The city does not care about the fortune or the house, or the careful routines that have been developed over decades to keep both intact. The city does not care about anything except its own forward motion. Streets are widened or rerouted. Neighborhoods shift in character. The buildings around her, the ones she does not own, are replaced by other buildings, taller and more modern, made of different materials in different styles, asserting a different aesthetic confidence. She regards this with something between suspicion and grief. The suspicion is automatic. Every change in the neighborhood represents a potential change in the property values, and changes in property values require reassessment, and reassessment requires engagement with lawyers and agents, and the whole apparatus of the financial world that she has always found both indispensable and threatening. Every change is an opening for someone to suggest she should sell something, or buy something, or restructure something, and every suggestion requires the enormous defensive energy of maintaining her position that nothing should change. Nothing should change. This is the principle on which the holding is based. If nothing changes, the thing being held cannot be lost. If the fortune remains exactly as it was on the day she inherited it, it cannot be taken from her. This is, she knows, not quite rational. Fortunes do not remain static simply because their owners wish them to. Money moves, markets move, the city moves. But the wish itself, the desperate wish for stasis, for a world in which the holding could simply continue forever, this wish is not irrational. It is a wish that makes emotional sense. It is the wish of someone who has been told, all her life, that loss is the great enemy, and who has devoted her life to the prevention of loss, and who has come to a point where the prevention of loss is the only definition of life she has. The grief is less acknowledged. She does not allow herself to call it grief because grief implies that she has lost something, and the position she has maintained successfully for 20 years is that she has not lost anything. She has preserved everything. She has been a perfect custodian. Her father would be proud. But in the late afternoons, in the light that comes through the windows of the parlour at that particular angle, that makes everything look both beautiful and final, there is something that moves through her that is not satisfaction. Something heavier. Something that has to do with the empty rooms in the upstairs floors, the rooms where her sisters used to sleep, the rooms that are cleaned regularly by the reduced staff, and that smell of cleaning products and dust rather than of the particular human warmth of habitation. Something that has to do with the books on the shelves that she has not opened in a long time. Something that has to do with the letters she does not write, because there is no one to write to, not really. No one who knows her well enough to receive a real letter, the kind that says what it means. She does not call this grief. She does not call it anything. She moves through it the way she moves through the house, automatically, without attention, trusting that the familiar route will not require anything unexpected from her. What would it have cost her to loosen the grip? This is the question that historians ask, looking back at the women who held on too long. What would they have given up if they had given something away? What would they have lost if they had allowed something to change? What was genuinely at risk once the father was dead and the will was executed and the fortune was legally and finally theirs? The honest answer is not much. Not as much as the fear said. Not as much as the voice in the head insisted. The world was not, in fact, organised to steal from them, though it sometimes wanted to. The strangers were not, in fact, all predators, though some of them were. The fortune was not, in fact, so fragile that a single wrong decision would shatter it. The real risk was far simpler and far more intimate. If they loosened the grip, they would have to feel the thing they were holding. Not abstractly, not through the mediation of ledgers and account books, but directly. The actual weight of it, the actual history of it, the actual human cost behind the numbers. And the feeling of it, once it came, might not stop. Feeling, in a life organised around its suppression, can seem like the most dangerous thing of all. The holding on was a way of not feeling. The perfect, white-knuckled, everything exactly as it was preservation of the fortune was a way of keeping the world at a distance. If you are managing the accounts, you cannot be moved by what the accounts represent. If you're checking the ledgers, you cannot be troubled by the faces behind the ledger entries. If you're maintaining the status quo, you cannot be expected to question the status quo, because questioning is not part of maintenance. And so they held. And the years passed, as years do, with a thoroughness that does not slow down for anyone. The city changed around them. The things they were protecting grew older and quieter. The maintenance required more effort. The staff grew fewer and more tired. The routines became harder to maintain precisely because they had never been questioned, and unquestioned routines accumulate inertia in the same way that unquestioned fortunes accumulate value, passively, automatically, without anyone deciding that they should. The women who held on too long eventually ran out of time. Not in a dramatic sense, not with a revelation or a crisis that broke open everything they had spent their lives containing. They ran out of time in the quiet way that time is always running out. One day at a time, one season at a time, the afternoons getting shorter and the mornings harder, and the city outside the window becoming a foreign country they no longer recognized. They died with the thing still in their grip. What they did not know, and could not have known, was that the grip did not preserve anything. The thing they were holding was already going, had been going for years, was held in place only by the pressure of the holding itself. Let go of a sand castle and the tide will take it. But the taking was always coming. The grip just meant that when it came, it took everything at once. The release, when it finally happened, was enormous. The legal proceedings, the claims, the inventories, the strangers walking through the rooms with their clipboards, the accounts opened and examined by people who had never been invited to look at them. The fortune dispersed into the general air of the economy, absorbed by the city that had generated it, returned to the unnamed pool from which it had come. The house empty, the rooms clean, the windows letting in light for the first time in years. In the absence of the holding, there is a tremendous spaciousness. It is too late for anyone who might have been freed by it, but the spaciousness is real, and it is in that spaciousness that the next story begins. The next story always begins in the aftermath of the holding. When the rooms are empty and the lawyers have gone and the building stands in the city light, no longer protected, no longer guarded, just itself, a building, old stone and old wood and old glass, with the memory of all those years of controlled stillness slowly releasing into the air. Let that release happen slowly in your imagination, the rooms breathing out, the years departing, the long-held tension loosening at last. The night is very deep now, the breathing very slow, the story holding you gently, as stories do in the deep hours, without urgency, without demand, just present, the way the old houses are present, full of what happened inside them, patient, waiting for nothing in particular. There were women, in the decades we are moving through, who built things. Not inherited them, not received them in the polished morning light of a lawyer's office, the papers already drawn up, the outcome already determined, built them, started with less than the people around them and ended with more, created enterprises from the particular combination of clear-eyed observation and sustained effort, and the specific genius for seeing what was needed and figuring out how to provide it. These women are harder to find in the historical record because the historical record was largely kept by people who did not expect to find them there. But they are there, working in the margins of the great industrial narratives, in the spaces left by the assumption that enterprise was masculine, running boarding houses that became small hotels that became institutions, managing millinery shops that grew into something more, operating employment agencies in an era when employment agencies barely existed, because the women flowing into the cities from the countryside needed someone to help them find work, and the men who ran the existing agencies were not particularly interested in placing domestic servants. These women did not always have glamorous stories, they often had very practical ones. The story of someone who needed to survive and found, in the work of surviving, something she was unexpectedly good at. The story of an aptitude discovered not through education or leisure but through the pressure of necessity. But the ones who ended up with empires, the ones who started with a boarding house and ended with a portfolio, or who started with a small shop and grew it, year by year, through clear-eyed reinvestment and careful attention, these women faced at some point their own version of the inheritance problem. Not the inheritance of someone else's fortune, but the inheritance of their own. The problem of what to do with something they had built, now that it had grown large enough to be a burden as well as an asset. The problem of succession, of management, of the moment when the thing they built with their hands became too large for their hands alone to hold. This is the moment when even the women who built it themselves sometimes lost it. Because the building of an enterprise is a different skill from the management of an enterprise, and the management of an enterprise is a different skill from the passing on of an enterprise, and the women who possessed the first skill did not always possess the second, and almost none of them possessed the third. Let us think about this in terms of a specific kind of business that many women of the Gilded Age era ran successfully: the hotel, or the boarding house that became, through years of careful expansion, something indistinguishable from a hotel. A building that provided rooms and meals to travellers and residents, managed by a woman who was present in it constantly, who knew every room and every guest and every preference and every quirk of the mechanical systems that kept the thing running. A woman whose knowledge was embodied, practical, immediate, who could tell by the sound of the pipes whether the boiler needed attention, who knew by the look of a prospective guest whether they would be trouble or not, who managed her staff with a combination of firmness and fairness that kept them for years, sometimes for decades, in an era when staff turnover was the great plague of the hospitality business. This woman's enterprise worked because she was in it, because her presence, her knowledge, her specific embodied competence was the enterprise. The hotel was not a system, it was her. Now age her 20 years, the body tires, the energy is not what it was. The early morning rounds through the kitchen, the evening checks of the registers, the constant monitoring of 100 details simultaneously, these become harder. She begins to delegate. She finds, in her delegation, the specific vulnerability of the self-made. The person who built a thing in their own image has not, generally, built a thing that can be transferred to another image. The system she has over decades refined exists largely in her head. Her staff is loyal to her personally, but has not been trained to run things without her. The operation is, in the strictest sense, not an operation at all. It is a performance of which she's the only possible performer. What does she do? Some of them sold. The sale of a well-run hotel to someone with capital and ambition was possible, and sometimes very profitable, and some of the women who had built these enterprises sold them while the selling was good, and retired on the proceeds to a comfortable but modest life that bore no resemblance to the grand aspirations of the Gilded Age, but suited them very well. Some of them tried to pass the enterprise to a child or a younger relative, and sometimes this worked and sometimes it did not, and the ones where it did not often ended badly for everyone involved. The child who inherits a mother's enterprise faces all the same problems as the daughter who inherits a father's. The thing built to someone else's measure, the expertise that cannot simply be transmitted, the question of identity inside the inherited role, but without the social protection that a Gilded Age fortune provides. Some of them held on, kept going past the point where the going was good, kept running the hotel or the shop or the agency through the deterioration of their own capacity, watching the enterprise slowly become less than it had been, unable to let it go because letting it go would mean admitting that the thing they had built with their hands was no longer truly theirs. And some of them, the ones worth sitting with tonight, the ones who made the specific choice that we might call, in the most generous possible reading, completion, walked away. Not in defeat, in completion. This distinction matters more than it might seem. To walk away in defeat is to have the thing taken from you, by circumstance, by financial failure, by the deterioration of the enterprise past the point of recovery. To walk away in completion is to make an active choice at the right moment, when the enterprise is still viable, when the walking away is still a choice rather than a necessity. It requires a specific kind of clear-eyed self-assessment that is its own rare capacity, the ability to look at what you have built and say, I have done what I came here to do, the work is done, it is time to step aside and let this be whatever it becomes without me. The women who walked away in completion often did something with the proceeds that surprised everyone. Not the obvious surprises, not the extravagant spending or the dramatic philanthropy. Smaller surprises, quieter ones. The woman who ran the boarding house for 30 years and built it into a hotel and sold the hotel and used the money to travel to the places she'd been describing to her guests for 3 decades. The California coast, the mountains of Colorado, the parts of Europe she'd only ever seen in the pictures guests left behind. She travelled simply, without the apparatus of wealthy tourism, taking rooms in the kinds of establishments she herself had run, eating at ordinary tables, talking to the people she met with the directness of someone who had spent 30 years in genuine conversation with strangers. She was, by the standards of her world, no one. She had no social position. She had no family name of consequence. She had a moderate sum from the sale of her hotel, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly. She had her health and her curiosity and the specific confidence of someone who has built something with her hands and knows, at a cellular level, that she is capable. She had, after 30 years of being the person other people came home to, the extraordinary and disorienting pleasure of having nowhere in particular to be. The first weeks of this were bewildering, not knowing where she would sleep the following week, not knowing what she would eat for dinner tomorrow, the absence of the morning rounds, the evening checks, the constant monitoring of the enterprise, the silence where the enterprise had been. But she grew into it. With time and distance and the slow accumulation of new experiences, she grew into the freedom of not being needed, of being, in any given hotel or boarding house or rented room, just another traveller, another person passing through. After 30 years of being the centre of everything, the freedom of the periphery was remarkable. There is another woman worth sitting with in this act, a woman who built something quite different. Not a physical enterprise, but a social one. The woman who managed, through a combination of intelligence and charm and the particular skill of making people feel well regarded, to position herself as an indispensable connector in the commercial world of her city. The woman who knew everyone, and through knowing everyone, made herself necessary. This is its own kind of empire, the empire of relationship, and it is one of the few kinds of empire in the Gilded Age that was genuinely unambiguously available to women, not as a secondary activity, but as the primary one. Because the social world was, in many ways, a woman's domain, and the woman who mastered it mastered something real. What she built, over years of careful attention and genuine interest, and the particular talent of remembering the thing someone told her in passing, and asking about it the next time she saw them, this woman built a network of mutual obligation and goodwill that had genuine commercial value. Merchants sent business her way, financiers took her recommendations. The families who needed reliable introductions to one another paid for her facilitation in the currency of social inclusion, which she converted quietly and without fanfare into the kind of financial stability that was otherwise very hard for a woman of her background to achieve. She never called it an empire. She would have been horrified by the term. What she called it, if she called it anything, was keeping house. Managing the household of her social world the way she managed the household of her actual home, with attention and care and the particular satisfaction of a thing done well. But it was an empire, a genuine one, and when she grew old and the energy required to maintain it was more than she had, and the empire began, quietly and inevitably, to contract, she felt the loss of it the way any empire builder feels the contraction. Not just the practical loss, the reduced invitations, the smaller circle, the slower flow of information and recommendation and mutual benefit. The deeper loss, the loss of the identity that the empire had provided, the loss of the specific sense of being necessary that had organized her days and given her purpose. This is the thing about building an empire, even a small one, even an unofficial one. It becomes you, and when it contracts, some of you contracts with it. The wise women, the ones who understood this in time, found ways to rebuild their sense of purpose in smaller and more durable materials, the domestic pleasures, the garden, the grandchildren, if there were grandchildren, The particular satisfaction of the well-made meal, the clean room, the morning cup of tea drunk in peace, the small empires of daily life that do not require vast resources to maintain, and that provide, if tended carefully, a genuine and lasting satisfaction. The less wise ones, the ones who could not make the transition, who could not find in smaller things the meaning they had found in the large enterprise, these women suffered, not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, just in the quiet, daily way of people who have lost their purpose and have not found a new one. The contracted world, the longer evenings, the persistent sense of being somehow less than what they used to be. Neither outcome is a failure exactly. Both are simply the human experience of time, of the way things grow and then diminish, of the particular challenge of finding meaning across the full arc of a life, rather than just in its most productive years. But the women who navigated this transition with grace, who understood that the empire was not the self, that the contraction of the enterprise was not the contraction of the person, these women left something worth noting. A model, quiet and undocumented, of how to hold a life loosely enough that it can change shape without breaking the person inside it. The night is very deep. The breathing is very slow. The stories are accumulating gently, layer on layer, like the seasons in the walls of old houses. Let the hotel rest in your mind for a moment. The woman who sold it and took a train west. The particular quality of the American West in the late afternoon. The light, the scale of things, the way the sky sits differently over the open country than it does over the city. She's sitting at a window of the train, watching the landscape change. She is going somewhere she has never been. She has, for the first time in 30 years, no one depending on her arrival. No one waiting for her to assess the state of things and make the adjustments that will keep everything running. The train is moving, the landscape is changing. She's watching it with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has at last nothing more pressing to do. Every empire in the end disperses. This is the fact that the people who build empires most consistently fail to reckon with, and it is understandable that they fail to reckon with it, because the reckoning would undermine the entire enterprise of building. You cannot build something enormous while genuinely believing it will not last. The building requires a faith in permanence that permanence itself refuses to honour. The great builders of the Gilded Age built with a conviction of continuity that was, in retrospect, almost touching in its confidence. They believed in the dynasty, the passing of the thing from father to son to grandson, each generation inheriting and managing and passing on, the fortune growing, not diminishing. The name remaining attached to the fortune generation after generation, so that the fortune and the name became synonymous, and the name itself became a kind of wealth. These are the names most people think of when they think of Gilded Age money, and those names carried, in the 1880s and 1890s, financial and social meaning that was almost indistinguishable from the fortunes themselves. But names, like fortunes, disperse. The daughters who inherited empires were, in many cases, the final concentrated form of those fortunes. They were the last point at which the wealth was held in a single set of hands before it dispersed. Some of them dispersed it intentionally, as we have seen. Some of them dispersed it inadvertently through the attrition of time and neglect and the 1,000 small decisions that compound into large changes. Some of them resisted the dispersal with everything they had, and in resisting it, made it inevitable, because the resistance itself was a kind of stagnation, and stagnation in an economic system produces the same outcome eventually as spending. The money stopped moving, and the world moved around it, and eventually the world moved far enough that the money was simply no longer relevant to the economy it had once defined. Let us think about what a dispersal actually looks like, not the legal dispersal, the court proceedings and the estates and the heirs claiming their portions, but the physical dispersal, the actual movement of things out of the place where they have been accumulated. Imagine the contents of the house after the last sister dies, the rooms that need to be cleared, the objects that have accumulated over decades, the furniture and the clothing and the books and the collections and the strange specific personal objects that gather around a life. The things kept because they were useful, and the things kept because they were sentimental, and the things kept because they were once beautiful, and the things kept because no one ever got around to deciding whether to keep them. The dispersal of this material history is its own kind of narrative. Some things are sold, the good furniture, the pieces that command real prices from dealers who know their value, the the jewellery appraised and auctioned, the silver weighed and calculated. These things leave the house efficiently, carried by strangers, wrapped in tissue and packed into cases, going to new places, new households, new contexts. A chair that sat for 40 years in a specific parlour, absorbing the specific light of those windows, ends up in a dealer's shop and then in a house in Connecticut and then, a generation later, at another auction. The chair continues, the parlour is gone. Some things are given to institutions. Libraries take the books, or some of them, the rare editions and the sets with their original bindings. Museums take the paintings occasionally, or the objects with demonstrable historical significance. Settlement houses and charities take the household goods, the linens and the kitchen equipment, and the ordinary furniture that is not worth selling but is worth using. Some things are thrown away. This is the hardest part to think about, for historians and for anyone who finds meaning in objects. The letters often go into the trash, the personal correspondence of a life, the actual voice of someone who is no longer alive to speak for themselves, destroyed because the family does not know what to do with it, or the estate does not have the money to archive it, or simply because no one thought to save it. The diaries, if there are diaries, the receipts and the household accounts and the notes in the margins of books, the personal artifacts of an interior life that was never given much public expression. The dispersal of these things is the final dispersal. Once the letters are gone, the person is gone in a different way, not just from the world, but from memory. The things that held the memory dispersed. Some of the Gilded Age heiresses left almost nothing behind, not because their lives were empty, but because the lives they lived were so private, so carefully contained, so deliberately removed from the record, that when they ended there was very little to retrieve. A few photographs, formal and uninformative, the financial records, meticulous but silent on everything except numbers. A deed here, a contract there. The material evidence of a life organised around preservation, of the fortune, of the family name, of the social position, of everything except the self. The self unrecorded. And yet the self was there. Every day, moving through those carefully maintained rooms, thinking its unrecorded thoughts, feeling its unrecorded feelings, every morning rising and carrying out the routines and managing the accounts, and moving through the hours. Every evening sitting in the fading light with the account books closed and the day done, and something quietly insistent in the background, the feeling of a life that might have gone differently. That feeling was not nothing, even though it left no record, even though the letters went into the trash and the diaries were never written, and the photographs show only the composed public face. The feeling was real. The unrecorded self was real. This is the thing about the dispersal that is hardest to accept, and also, somehow, the most important. The dispersal does not erase what was there. It just makes it harder to see. The feeling that was never written down was still felt. The thought that was never spoken was still thought. The desire that was never expressed was still desired. All of it real, all of it happened, all of it part of the actual history of a person and a family and a time. The great houses are gone, the fortunes are dispersed, the names are fading. The women who lived in those houses and held those fortunes and carried those names are, for the most part, not where the history books go to look. But they were there, moving through their days, managing their accounts, sitting in the late afternoon light, thinking the thoughts they thought. We are sitting with them tonight. Not to recover what was lost, that cannot be done. Not to render judgment on the choices that were made or not made, that is not ours to render. Just to sit with them, in the rooms that are gone now, with the light that has long since moved on, attending to the quality of a life that the record did not think to preserve. There is a specific kind of attention that is paid to the lost, a quality of listening for something that can no longer speak directly. Reading the silences, inferring from the absences, building a picture from the things that remain, the account books, the deed, the chair that was not thrown away, and from the things that do not remain, the gaps in the record where a person's actual voice might have been. This kind of attention is not quite history. It is something older, the attention paid to the missing, the specific human need to not let the lost be entirely lost. The account books are beautiful in their way. The handwriting precise and consistent across years, decades. The figures entered in the same careful hand that entered everything. Rents received and rents overdue, repairs deferred and repairs eventually made, the slow arithmetic of accumulation. They are the voice that was permitted, the record that was considered worth keeping. Behind that voice, the other voice, the one that was not kept. In the hours left in this night, we will try to hear it. Not as reconstruction, not as invention, but as the quality of attention that the silence deserves. The sitting with, the patient listening, the willingness to stay in the room long enough for the room to give up something of what it holds. The dispersal has happened, the rooms are empty, the letters are gone. But the night is here, and the listening is here, and the quality of the late hour, the deep quiet of a world that has stopped performing itself and is simply being what it is, makes the listening possible in ways that the busy daytime hours never quite allow. The house is empty now, the rooms echo slightly. The good furniture is gone, carried away in the morning by the dealers and their careful wrapping. The rugs have been rolled and removed. The windows without their drapes let in more light than they have let in for decades. The particular clear afternoon light of a day in early spring, falling on bare floors and empty shelves and the small squares of brighter paint where the pictures used to hang. The pictures are gone. The woman who collected them is gone. The fortune that purchased them is dispersed. What remains is the light, falling on the empty floor the way light falls when it has nothing to obstruct it. Clean, impersonal, present. The room is just a room now, and the room is enough. The women who inherited empires carried more than the fortunes. This is the thing that is easy to miss, looking at the financial records and the legal proceedings and the newspaper accounts and the various forms of external documentation that constitute the historical evidence of their lives. The fortunes are documented, the properties are mapped, the account books survive, the court cases are on record. What is not on record, what rarely is on record for anyone, is the interior weight. The interior weight, the specific heaviness of the things a person carries that have nothing to do with money or property or legal title. The grief, the guilt, the obligation, the love that is complicated by its objects, the anger that has never been allowed to fully arrive, the hope that has been waiting for so long that it has started to feel like grief itself. The daughters of the Gilded Age fortunes carried all of these things, and they carried them without much support. The specific support structures that existed for the management of grief and obligation in their world were structures that did not generally encourage women to examine what they were carrying. Church offered comfort, but of the kind that discouraged examination. The medical establishment offered diagnosis, but of the kind that turned women's inner lives into pathologies to be managed. The social world offered distraction, but only from the outside. The thing inside, the actual weight, continued to sit where it had always been sitting. Let us think about what grief specifically looked like in these households. Not the acute grief of recent loss, the older kind, the grief that has been living alongside a person for so long that they have ceased to recognize it as grief and have simply incorporated it into the landscape of their interior life, the way a house incorporates a damp patch in the wall. You know it is there, you have always known it is there, you have learned to work around it without addressing it. The grief of the daughters who inherited was, most often, the grief of the lives they had not lived. This sounds abstract, but it was not abstract for them. It was as specific as the face of the man who had been turned away at the door when she was 22, as specific as the child she had not had, whose non-existence was not a fact she had chosen, but a fact that had been chosen for her, as specific as the places she had never gone, the rooms she had never been in, the conversations she had never been allowed to have. This grief was real. It was there in the body. It showed up in the particular way some of these women moved through their houses, with a deliberateness, a carefulness, a quality of managed motion that speaks of something being controlled. It showed up in the habits, the particular compulsions that developed in lives where the only form of agency permitted was management, so that management became the medium through which everything was expressed. The perfect household accounts, the immaculate record-keeping, the obsessive review of the same documents over and over as if checking again might produce a different result. It showed up in the things they kept. Objects tell the story that the documents suppress. In the great houses of the Gilded Age, when they were finally cleared, when the families or the lawyers or the estate managers finally went through the rooms, they found, alongside the expected contents, the furniture and the silver and the carefully maintained financial records, the other things, the things that had no market value and no legal significance, and that survived only because they were in a drawer instead of in plain sight, and because no one thought to throw them away. A small portrait of a young man, unsigned and undated, hidden in a drawer in one of the bedrooms. No one could identify who the young man was. A child's shoe, a single one kept in a box. An embroidered handkerchief with an initial that did not correspond to any of the household's known members. Small specific objects whose significance was entirely private. What does a person hold on to when they have decided to hold on to nothing except the fortune? These things, the small ones, the ones that have no market value, the ones that hold, in their keeping, the record of something the account books could not show. The objects are the grief in portable form, the way of carrying the unlived life. The women who carried these things, and all of them carried something, some version of the unlived life preserved in small objects or in habits of thought, or in the specific quality of their attention at certain times of day, were not weak or sentimental in any pejorative sense. They were women living inside an extraordinary constraint, the constraint of having been given everything and permitted almost nothing, the constraint of inhabiting a body that wanted and a world that said no. They did what people have always done with constraint. They found the small spaces that it did not reach. They preserved in those small spaces the evidence of their own aliveness, the portrait in the drawer, the child's shoe, the handkerchief. The things they carried were not the fortunes. The fortunes were weights imposed from outside. The things they carried were the evidences of desire, of the self that had existed before the fortune arrived and that had continued to exist, secretly, privately, in the small spaces between the managed hours throughout the years of the holding. In later life, in the houses that had grown quiet and empty, some of them sat with these small objects for hours, not examining them, not cataloguing them, just sitting with them, the portrait in the lap, the shoe on the side table, the quality of attention very still. This is what the account books do not record. The sitting with the small object, the quality of attention that is not managing or protecting or preserving, but simply being present with something that means something. The specific human act of holding the evidence of who you were before you became what the world needed you to be. Outside the window, the city continues, the carriages and later the automobiles, the gas lights and later the electric lights, the same changing sky over the same changing city, indifferent to the woman in the window with the portrait in her lap. The sitting with. This is what survives, in some form, in the stories we tell about these women. Not the fortunes which are dispersed, not the properties which are redeveloped, not the names which are fading. Something about the quality of the sitting with, something about the truth that even inside enormous wealth and enormous constraint, the small human life insisted on itself, insisted on carrying its evidences of desire, insisted on keeping the portrait and the shoe and the handkerchief, insisted in its small spaces on being alive. We carry things too. Tonight, in the late hour, in the quiet room, there is probably something you carry that has not been set down. Some small weight, some old question, some evidence of a self that continues to exist in the margins of the managed life. You do not have to set it down tonight. The carrying is its own kind of keeping. But notice it, perhaps. In the quiet of this hour, with the story of these women somewhere in the back of the mind, notice the thing you carry, the small object in the mental drawer, the specific warmth of it, the way it has been with you so long that you have stopped feeling it as weight. Let it be there, acknowledged, present, not requiring anything. The room is very still. The night has reached that particular depth where the hours before morning begin to feel possible, where the distinction between sleep and waking loosens, and the mind starts to take on the quality of the dreaming mind, more associative, more tolerant of mystery, less insistent on the organization of things into the categories the daytime requires. In this loosening, let the women settle around you, not as ghosts, as presences, the specific human presence of people who were very much alive in their time, who moved through rooms that are gone now, who carried things in their hands and in their hearts that the record could not hold, who sat in afternoon light and asked quiet questions that no one was waiting to answer, who kept the small objects in the drawers, who made the choices they made and lived inside them and were shaped by them and shaped them in return. They were here. And because they were here, and because we are here listening in the deep hours, there is a kind of presence that persists, not supernatural, not mystical, just the ordinary persistence of the human, the way any life that was fully lived leaves a mark in the world it moved through, even when the material evidence of that life is gone. The carrying continues. In the quiet room, in the late hour, in the story that holds you as gently as sleep. There is a time in the afternoon, somewhere between 3 and 5, that belongs to a different kind of thinking. The morning's urgency has passed. The day's obligations are mostly met, or if they are not met, the decision has been made, consciously or not, that they will not be met today. The evening is still distant enough that its own specific pressures have not yet arrived. The light is different, lower, warmer. It comes through the windows at an angle that makes familiar things look strange, and strange things look almost beautiful, and everything look a little more final than it looked at 10 in the morning. The women of the Gilded Age households knew this light well. It was the light of the sitting room in late autumn, the light of tea, the light of the particular kind of quiet conversation that the afternoon allows. Not the morning's efficient talk, the coordination of household activities, the management of staff and schedules. Not the evening's formal conversation, the maintained performances of dinner and drawing room. The afternoon talk was more unguarded, more given to wandering, more willing to allow a sentence to end somewhere other than where it began. The women who inhabited the great houses in the decades of the Gilded Age and after spent many of their hours in this afternoon light. They read, they embroidered, they took tea, they talked to their sisters in the houses where sisters were still present, or they sat in the particular silence of households from which the sisters had gone. The silence of those afternoons was not empty. It was full of the kind of thought that afternoon thinking generates. Slow, associative, not aimed at any particular conclusion. The kind of thinking that follows the light as it moves across the room, that notices the way the dust hangs in the beam near the window, that lets the mind wander through the morning's events and the previous day's events and the events of years ago, all of them existing in the same flat present of afternoon memory. In this thinking, things connected that were not supposed to connect. The rent receipt in the morning's mail and the face of the woman glimpsed from the carriage window in the part of the city where the buildings were old and close together. The account book and the drawing in the newspaper of the conditions in the tenements. The ledger entry for the building on such and such a street, and the memory of walking past that street once years ago and seeing the children playing in the gutter because there was nowhere else to play. The connections in the afternoon light were harder to dismiss than they were in the morning, when there was always something more immediate demanding attention. In the afternoon, with the tea cooling and the light moving and nowhere in particular to be, the connections arrived and stayed and required something. What they required was not always clear, but they required something. For some of the women, the afternoon was when the decision formed, not dramatically, not with the sudden clarity of a revelation that changes everything, more slowly, more like the way a decision forms in sleep, where you go into the night uncertain and come out the other side having somehow settled something without quite knowing how. The afternoon thinking was like that, slow, below the surface, arriving at conclusions that the morning's more defended consciousness would not have permitted. For others, the afternoon was when the grief arrived. Without the morning's purposefulness to hold it at bay, and without the evening's social armouring to protect against it, the afternoon was when the thing that had no name made its presence felt most clearly. The sitting in the chair with the cooling tea and the moving light, and the awareness, not quite a feeling, something more ambient than a feeling, of the accumulated weight of all the afternoons before. All the afternoons in this same chair, with this same tea, with the same light moving in the same direction, and the hours moving as they always moved, and the life that was not quite being lived continuing to not quite be lived. This awareness was not depression, in the clinical sense, or not only that, it was something more specific to the situation. a particular species of melancholy available only to people who have more than they need and less than they want, where what they want is not more of the material things that constitute their more, but the other things, the unmeasurable things, the things that money cannot be usefully applied to. Connection, movement, the feeling of a life that was responsive to its own interior rather than organised around someone else's. The afternoon thinking turned on these things, softly, slowly, without urgency. Just the awareness, recurring, returning, the question that the morning's busyness kept at bay. What is this for? Not aggressively asked, not demanding an answer, just present in the afternoon light, the way the dust is present in the beam near the window. Noticed, not resolved. The women who sat in these afternoons and allowed themselves to actually sit in them, not to escape them through busyness, not to manage them through the account books or the household rounds, but to genuinely sit in the stillness and the question. These women were doing something that their world did not value or even recognize. They were doing the work of an unguarded interior life. There is no word for this in the vocabulary of the Gilded Age. There was no structure in the culture of those households that supported it, or named it, or said, yes, this is important. Yes, this matters. Yes, the sitting with the question, the allowing of the afternoon grief, the patient attendance to the life that is not quite being lived, this counts. It counted, even without the vocabulary, even without the cultural support. The woman in the chair with the cooling tea was doing something real. We might call it simply living, but in a way that the record of the Gilded Age rarely captures. Not the performed life, the dinners, the accounts, the carefully maintained household, but the actual life, the interior life, the one that continued quietly and stubbornly in the spaces the performance left open. The afternoons had their own recurring imagery. The particular way the light moved across the east wall of the sitting room, travelling from the left window to the right, making a slow transit that organised the afternoon into something measurable. The sound of the city below, muffled by the heavy drapes and the thick walls but never entirely absent. The particular frequency of urban sound that sits just below audible and is felt rather than heard. The smell of tea, and underneath it the smell of the house itself, the accumulated scent of the specific combination of things that had been here for decades, building up in the fabric of the rooms until the smell was the house. These sensory details grounded the afternoon thinking in the particular, prevented it from becoming too abstract. You could not think for long about the nature of freedom, or the question of what a life was for when the tea was making that smell, and the light was doing that thing on the east wall and the city was making its low, almost inaudible sound below. The body pulled the mind back into the specific, into this room, this afternoon, this particular quality of light. It is its own kind of wisdom, the body's insistence on the particular. There is a woman sitting in such a room, in such an afternoon, in such a light. She's in her late 50s. She has been managing the estate for 15 years since her father died. She has done it well according to the metrics that exist for measuring such things. The accounts are balanced. The properties are maintained more or less within the standards she has set for herself. The rents arrive. The lawyers are paid. The household runs. She has done exactly what was required of her, and she has done it exactly as she was taught. And sitting now in the afternoon light, she feels not unhappy exactly. Not unhappy. Something more neutral than unhappy. Something more like the feeling of having arrived at a destination and found it to be exactly as described in the guide, accurate in every detail, and somehow entirely unlike what you had imagined. This is the life she was prepared for. This is the life she has built. It is, by any external measure, a successful life. She owns things. She has standing. She is known, in the circles that matter in her world, as a reliable and capable person. She has fulfilled her obligations to the fortune her father built, and to the memory of her father, and to the ideal of good stewardship that organised her childhood. She has done everything right. And sitting in the afternoon light, with the cooling tea and the sound of the city and the smell of the house, she is aware of something that has been waiting, patient, in the margins of all the doing everything right. The something has no name. She has not permitted it name because naming things is a kind of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is the beginning of the obligation to act. If she names the something, she will have to decide what to do about it. so she has not named it. She has allowed it to remain as what it is, an unnamed presence in the afternoon, a quality of weight that arrives with the particular light and departs slightly when the evening begins and the performance resumes. But today the weight is heavier than usual, or perhaps she's simply less able today to hold it at arm's length. She sets down the teacup. She looks at the east wall where the light is doing its slow transit. She allows for a moment the unnamed thing to be simply there, present in the room with her, not managed, not contained, just there. What does it want, the unnamed thing? It wants what any suppressed thing wants: recognition, acknowledgement, the simple courtesy of being seen. She looks at it, directly, for the first time in a long time, and it does not demand anything dramatic. It does not demand that she sell the properties or abandon the estate or run away to Europe. It asks for very little in the end. Only this, that she acknowledge, in the privacy of the afternoon, that the life she's living is not entirely the life she would have chosen. She does. In the privacy of the afternoon she does. And something in the room shifts slightly. The weight is still there, but it is different. It has been seen. It is somehow lighter for the seeing. The light continues its transit across the east wall. The tea is cold. The sound of the city continues below. She picks up the teacup. She looks at the cold tea. She stands, goes to the window and looks out at the street below with the full, unhurried attention she rarely allows herself. The street is ordinary. The people moving along it are ordinary. The city going about its afternoon business in the ordinary way. She watches it for a long time, without managing her watching, without purpose or agenda or the intention to report what she has seen to anyone. Just watching, just being there, at the window, in the light, present in the ordinary afternoon of the city below. This too is something the account books do not record. And this too counts. What comes after an empire? The question sounds large, and in the political and historical sense it is large. The fall of empires is one of the great organizing narratives of human history, the arc that runs from Babylon to Rome to Constantinople and beyond, each one ending in some combination of external pressure and internal failure, each one leaving behind a silence that the next formation rushes to fill. But in the smaller sense, the domestic sense, the sense we have been moving through tonight, the question is quieter. What comes after the empire of the household? After the great house and the managed fortune and the elaborate social machinery of the Gilded Age? After the daughters who inherited and managed and held on and gave away and eventually, one by one, were absorbed back into the general silence that preceded them? What was left? In the material sense, we know what was left. The buildings, eventually sold and redeveloped. The fortunes, dispersed through inheritance proceedings and legal fees, and the simple attrition of time. The names, lingering for a few generations in the historical record and then fading into footnote. In the human sense, what was left was the next generation. The children of the heirs, the distant relatives who inherited the dispersed portions of the fortunes. The people who arrived in the lawyers' offices with their documents and their claims, and their various connections to the women who had held the empires and were now gone. And these people, the ones who came after, inherited something that no will addressed and no lawyer could transmit. The psychological estate. The patterns, the specific ways of relating to money and to others and to the world, shaped over generations of accumulation and control, and the particular emotional inheritance of growing up inside someone else's enormous fear. The patterns of hoarding, of distrust, of the instinctive reach for control in situations that felt uncertain. The patterns of self-suppression, of making oneself small inside large spaces, of performing the expected thing rather than doing the authentic thing. These patterns were not written into any document. They were written into the people, into their habits of thought, their reflexive responses, the things they reached for when they felt threatened. Some of the people who came after recognized these patterns in themselves and worked to change them. Not always successfully, not all at once, not without the specific difficulty that comes from trying to change something installed in you before you had the language to resist its installation, but with genuine effort, with the specific courage of people who have looked clearly at what they inherited, not just the money, but the way of being in the world that the money encoded, and decided that they wanted to live differently. Some of them did not recognize the patterns. They lived inside them without knowing, the way the daughters had lived inside the rules of the great houses without always knowing that rules were what they were. The patterns shaped them in ways they could not see, because the patterns were the water they swam in. It looked like the world. It looked like reality. It looked like the way things simply were. The women who burned their empires, the ones we have been sitting with tonight, did something that their histories often do not credit. They disrupted the transmission. Not always intentionally, not always cleanly. Some of the burning was its own kind of damage, its own repetition of the original pattern in a different register. The hoarding replaced by spending, the control replaced by abandon, the fear manifesting in a different direction. These disruptions did not necessarily produce better outcomes in the short term. But they broke the exact replication. They introduced something new into the chain, the unambiguous, unchanging, perfectly preserved transmission of the patriarch's fear. That, at least, they interrupted. An interruption is not nothing. Interruption is the beginning of the possibility of something different. Let us stay with this for a moment, the possibility of something different. In the long view of these stories, looking back from the distance of a century or more, with the benefit of perspective that none of the people living inside them could have, the most important thing about the women who burned their empires is not the burning itself, not the scandal or the court case or the dramatic renunciation or the quiet giving away. The most important thing is what the burning made possible. For the women themselves, usually not very much. The burning often came too late. The years in the house, the years of the holding or the fear or the managed performance had already consumed most of what might have been. The woman who finally gave the fortune away in her 60s, who finally allowed herself to want something other than the preservation of the estate. She had decades of living to do differently, and the decades had already passed. What remained was the end of her life, spent differently than the beginning and the middle, but still shaped by everything that had come before. For the people who came after, more, sometimes much more. The heir who inherited not a great fortune but a moderate one, because the fortune had been given away and what remained was enough but not vast. This heir had fewer choices in some ways, and more in others. Fewer of the choices that great wealth provides, the choices that are really just the multiplication of existing options. More of the choices that a moderate, sufficient fortune makes possible, the choices that require the person to actually decide what they want, rather than simply multiplying what they already have. The heir who inherited a set of patterns that had been interrupted, rather than a set of patterns intact and complete, and organizing from the inside out, this heir had work to do. The work of figuring out which patterns served them and which did not, which were worth keeping and which were worth releasing. This is hard work. It is the work of a conscious life, of a person who does not simply inherit their way of being, but actually, actively, chooses it. That work, when it is done well, produces people who know themselves, who have looked at the family history and understood which parts of it are worth carrying and which parts are worth releasing, who move through the world with the specific confidence of someone who has chosen their values rather than received them. These people are not always happy. The conscious life is not a guaranteed path to happiness, but they are, in a way that matters, free. Free in the sense that the Wendell sisters were not free. Free in the sense that the woman in the afternoon chair was not free, or was not yet free, or was only beginning at the very end to become free. That freedom is what the burning makes possible. Not guaranteed, not immediate, not available to the person doing the burning, who is often consumed by the burning, but available eventually to the people who come after, who inherit not a great fortune preserved intact, but a question. The question the burning raises, the question that any dramatic rearrangement of accumulated wealth raises. What is this for? We have been sitting with that question all night, in various forms, in various rooms, with various women asking it in various ways, at various stages of their lives. The question does not resolve. That is its nature. Fortunes change and lives change, and the answer that worked for one generation does not simply pass to the next. Each generation has to find its own answer, in the specific circumstances of its own life, with the specific resources it has been given. But the question itself can be passed on, and the passing on of the question, the willingness to refuse the easy, the inherited, the unexamined answer and to keep asking, is perhaps the most valuable thing any of these women left behind. The empire builders of the Gilded Age left buildings and accounts and the material evidence of enormous effort. Some of that material evidence still stands in modified and often unrecognizable form in the cities they helped build. Their daughters, the inheritors and the burners and the holders and the givers away, these women left something less visible and more durable. They left the evidence that the question had been asked, that someone in the midst of all the accumulation had looked up from the account books and asked what any of it was for. The asking does not produce an answer, but the asking changes things. The asking is what makes the next generation's freedom possible, even when the asking person does not live to see that freedom materialize. We are moving now toward the end of our time together tonight. The story has travelled a long way, through the great houses of the Gilded Age, through the long afternoons sitting, through the burning and the holding and the giving away and the dispersal, through the interior lives that the account books did not record and the questions that the afternoons made room for. The houses are mostly gone, the fortunes are mostly dispersed, the names are mostly forgotten. What remains? There is a particular quality of air in a place where something enormous used to be. Not the absence of presence exactly, the presence of absence, the specific way that a place holds the memory of what it was before it was what it is now. You can feel it in old buildings, not haunted in the supernatural sense, but saturated with the accumulated weight of all the living that was done inside them. The walls remember, if walls can be said to remember. The quality of the light is different in a room that has been lived in for a long time than in a room that is newly built. The sites of the great Gilded Age mansions, the ones that were demolished to make way for the buildings that New York needed in the 20th century, the glass towers and the office buildings and the apartment complexes, carry something of this quality, a slight difference in the air, a sense, if you're paying attention, of something that was here, something significant, something that involved the full range of human experience, ambition and fear and grief and love, and the endless negotiation between what was wanted and what was allowed. That quality is what history preserves, imperfectly and incompletely, but preserves. Not the fortunes, not the ledgers, not the names eventually, but the quality of the human, the fact that people were here, that they lived, fully and incompletely inside the constraints and freedoms of their particular time, that they wanted things, that they feared things, that they sat in afternoon light and asked unanswerable questions and sometimes, in small ways and large, found their way towards something true. The women who inherited empires and burned them and held on and gave them away and gradually, one by one, were absorbed back into the general silence that preceded them. They were here. They are here now, in some sense, in the shape of the story we have been telling, in the quality of attention we have been paying, in the willingness to sit with the complicated, undocumented, unspectacular truth of lives that were more than their fortunes, more than their scandals, more than the cautionary tales they became. They were women. In the full, uncontainable, imperfectly documented sense, women with bodies that wanted warmth and touch, women with minds that ran in all directions when given the room to run, women with the specific capacity for grief that comes from knowing what was possible and finding it blocked, and the specific capacity for joy that comes from finding, in small and unexpected places, a world that is larger than the one that was built for them. They were here. And the story, the one we have been telling together in the deep hours of this night, is one way of honouring that. Not with monuments, not with plaques, just with attention, with the quality of sitting with the willingness to say, you were real. Your afternoon thinking was real. Your grief was real. The portrait in the drawer was real, and what it represented was real, and the woman who kept it was real, and her life was more than the sum of her accounts. There are houses in American cities, if you know where to look, that carry their history in their bones. Not the grand restored mansions, the ones that have been converted into museums or corporate headquarters, and whose histories are displayed on plaques near the front door, organised into accessible paragraphs about the people who built them and the events that happened inside them. Those houses have been made legible, translated into the public language of heritage and landmark and historical significance. Their histories have been processed and presented and in some essential way, tamed. The houses we're thinking about tonight are different. They are the ones that were not saved in time, or not saved at all. The ones that became something else. Office buildings, apartment blocks, parking structures, empty lots where someone planted a few struggling trees and called it a park. The ones where the history is not displayed but is simply there, ambient, available to anyone who has the patience to look for it. In New York City, there are streets where the buildings that stand now are the third or fourth generation of buildings on that particular ground. The Gilded Age mansion is gone, replaced by the apartment building of the 1920s, which is still there but has been renovated until very little of the original remains, and beside it a glass tower from the 1980s, whose lobby floor covers what was once a garden, where a woman once stood in a November morning and watched the leaves come down from the few remaining trees in that block of the city. The garden is gone, the mansion is gone, the woman who stood in the garden is gone many decades past. The glass tower does not know any of this. But the ground knows. This is the kind of thought that comes in the deep hours, and it is a thought worth sitting with, even though it cannot be verified or acted upon or made into anything useful. The ground knows. The soil under the concrete and the foundations and the utility lines and the subway tunnels, the original earth of the island, the particular composition of Manhattan schist and glacial deposits, and the river silt that accumulated over millennia before anyone put a city on top of it. This ground does not care about fortunes or empires or the stories we tell about the people who accumulated them. It was here before the Gilded Age, and it will be here after the glass towers, whenever the glass towers' time comes, as it will. There is something settling about this, something that the deep hour makes available in the same way it makes other honest things available, not by forcing them into the foreground, but by removing the noise and the daylight performance that usually keep them in the background. The ground endures. The stories we tell about the people who lived on it are temporary. The people themselves were temporary. All of it is passing, has always been passing, and the passing is not a tragedy so much as the nature of things. The quality of change and impermanence that everything participates in, the ground included, just on a timescale so vast that it might as well be permanence from where we stand. In the temporary, the beautiful. In the passing, the value. This is the thought that the late hour offers, not as consolation, it is not trying to console, just as observation. The way the good long stories always end, not with a resolution, but with a widening, a sense of the particular thing we have been attending to opening out into the larger thing of which it is a part. The woman and her inheritance, opening into the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, opening into the longer story of wealth and power and the human arrangements we build around them. That longer story, opening into the still longer story of the land and the time and the impermanent beautiful fact of being here at all, in these particular bodies, in these particular rooms, on this particular night. We have been moving through stories of women who inherited more than they could hold, who were shaped by inheritances they did not choose, who made choices that were sometimes admirable and sometimes ruinous, and always, in their own way, true to the specific human circumstances that produced them. We have sat with them in their afternoon light and their long evenings and their careful account books and their drawers of small private objects. We have tried to hear the voice behind the account book, the self behind the performance, the life behind the legacy. What do we take from this as we move toward the end of the night? Not a lesson exactly. The stories of the Gilded Age heiresses are too various, too specific to their own circumstances, too shaped by a world that no longer exists in the form they inhabited, to produce clean lessons that translate directly to other times and situations. What works as a lesson for one of them does not work for the others. What looks like wisdom in one story looks like tragedy in another. But something that accumulates over the hours we have spent together, the way good things accumulate. Not suddenly, not with a single decisive moment, but slowly, layer by layer, each layer adding a small amount and together adding up to something substantial. The something is this. Wealth is a medium, like language, or stone, or any other material that human beings use to build their worlds. It is not intrinsically good or bad. It is shaped by the hands that hold it, and it shapes the hands that hold it, and what it becomes depends enormously on the intentions and the fears and the specific human circumstances of the people who have it. The Gilded Age women whose stories we have been sitting with tonight were not destroyed by wealth. They were shaped by the specific relationship to wealth that they inherited, along with the wealth itself, from the people who built it. The relationship that wealth was fragile, that the world was hostile, that the only safe response to having it was to guard it, that the guarding was the purpose and the fortune was the end. This relationship, inherited and installed before they had the intellectual equipment to question it, did the work that their fortunes could not. Their fortunes could have freed them. The relationship prevented the freedom. This is the thing worth carrying from these stories, not the specific details of the Wendell Mansion or the Gilded Age drawing rooms, but the more general truth that what we inherit from the people who shape us is not only the material things, it is the relationship to the material things, the story we tell about what they are for, the emotional logic that organizes how we hold them. And that relationship, that story, that emotional logic, these can be examined, can be questioned, can be changed slowly and with difficulty, and without any guarantee of success, but changed nonetheless. The inheritance of the psychology is not the inheritance of the fortune. The fortune once received belongs to whoever receives it. The psychology requires active work to change. Some of the women we have visited tonight did that work. Some of them did it badly or partially or too late. Some of them did it well and quietly and left no record that they had done it, only the evidence of different choices than the inheritance would have predicted. All of them were trying in their various ways to figure out what they were for, what the fortune was for, what the endless, careful management of something enormous was supposed to produce. The question is not unique to the Gilded Age. It arrives, in various forms, for anyone who has been given something significant and not been given the tools to understand what to do with it. The something does not have to be a fortune. It can be a family name, a set of expectations, a particular understanding of what success looks like, a way of being in the world that was handed to you before you were old enough to choose it. The question is always the same: what is this for? And the answer is always something that cannot be given from outside. It can only be arrived at from inside in the specific circumstances of a specific life, through the slow work of paying attention to what actually matters as opposed to what has been told to matter, through the afternoons, through the sitting with, through the small objects in the drawer and the portraits in the lap, and the moments at the window looking out at the city below, with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has at last decided to actually see. The night is nearly finished. The deep hours are giving way to something lighter. Not light exactly, not yet, but the particular quality of air that precedes light, the slight softening of the dark that the late night always becomes eventually. The story is settling, the women are quiet, the rooms are at rest. In the drawer of a desk in a house that no longer exists, in a part of a city that looks nothing now like it looked then, there is an imagined portrait of an imagined young man whose name has been lost along with everything else. The woman who kept it is long gone, the desk is gone, the house is gone. But something of the keeping remains, in the texture of this night, in the quality of the attention we have paid, in the willingness to sit with the small private fact of a life that carried more than the account books showed. The keeping continues, in the form of the story, in the form of the night that held it. And in the quiet room where you are in the particular dark of this particular late hour, the keeping is here too, soft and present and not requiring anything. Just here. Just the night and the story and the quality of rest that comes after the sitting with. The newspapers of the Gilded Age loved a scandal. They had good reasons to love one. The reading public in the 1880s and 1890s was hungry for the particular satisfaction of watching the very wealthy behave badly. Not because the readers were vindictive, or not only because of that, because the lives of the very wealthy were otherwise so thoroughly sealed off from ordinary experience that any breach in the ceiling was genuinely interesting. The glimpse through the curtain, the moment when the performance slipped and something human showed through. The women who gave the newspapers what they wanted, the spectacular expenditure, the unsuitable attachment, the public display of behaviour that polite society considered incompatible with the position they occupied, these women ended up in the historical record in a specific way. They became cautionary tales. Or in the more sympathetic retellings, they became early examples of female independence, precursors to later, more thoroughly documented struggles for women's autonomy and self-determination. Either way, they were remembered. The women the newspapers missed are a different story. The woman who spent 40 years managing an inherited real estate portfolio in New York City, who made careful and competent decisions year after year, who navigated the transition from the 19th century to the 20th without losing anything significant, who eventually left her fortune intact and well managed to a combination of her nieces and nephews and several institutions that she had come to believe did useful work. This woman did not make the newspapers. She was not scandalous. She was not dramatic. She was, in the specific vocabulary of her era, a credit to her family and an example of responsible stewardship. She was also, in every practical sense, exceptional. Most of the women who inherited great fortunes did not manage them as well as she did. Most of them encountered the obstacles, the resistant lawyers, the managing relatives, the social structures that actively discouraged women from engaging with their own finances, and found those obstacles harder to navigate. Some of them navigated them badly. Some gave up trying and handed the management to someone else. Some fought, expensively and exhaustingly, against the constant pressure to abdicate responsibility for things that were legally and rightfully theirs. The woman who navigated them well left almost nothing behind. The estate is documented because estates are always documented. The competent management is visible in the records for anyone who cares to look closely enough to read the evidence of sound decision-making in ledger entries. But the person who made those decisions, her experience of making them, the particular challenges she faced, the strategies she developed, the moments of doubt and the moments of confidence, and the long, patient effort of doing something difficult without anyone around her acknowledging that it was difficult, this is not in the record. We are going to try to imagine it tonight. Not to invent. Imagination is not invention, but to attend, closely and with genuine curiosity, to the texture of what such a life might have felt like from the inside, to give the competent, invisible woman the same quality of attention we have been giving all night to her more dramatic counterparts. She rose early. She had always been an early riser. It was something she had in common with her father, whose habits of life she had absorbed without quite intending to. The household was usually still quiet when she came downstairs, the light just beginning outside the windows, the kitchen beginning its morning routines with sounds that drifted up through the floors as a kind of ambient reassurance that the day was getting started without her having to manage it into existence. She made her own tea on most mornings, not because the staff could not have brought it, but because the few minutes of the early morning before the household began its official day were the minutes most entirely her own, and she was protective of them in a way she was not particularly protective of anything else. This was the time when she thought most clearly, when the day had not yet organized itself around obligations and she could simply think, without the thinking being required to produce anything specific. She thought about the properties, not obsessively, not in the anxious circular way that had characterized her father's management of them, the constant vigilance against threat that had eventually colored every corner of his life. She thought about them the way a farmer thinks about land, with a long view, with patience, with the understanding that things take time, and that the best management is often the management that does not interfere unnecessarily with what is already working. She had come to this understanding slowly. It was not the understanding she had received with the inheritance. The understanding she had received was her father's understanding, that the world was hostile, that the tenants were potential thieves, that the lawyers were potential vultures, that the only safe position was the position of total control. This understanding had produced in him an empire. It had also produced in him a life of extraordinary isolation and anxiety. She had seen the anxiety clearly. She had grown up inside it, had absorbed it the way children absorb everything in the household they grow up in, without intending to, without analyzing it, simply by breathing the same air. And then, in the years after he died and the estate came to her, she had noticed the anxiety operating in herself and had made a deliberate choice, one of the few really deliberate choices of her early life, to examine it rather than simply act from it. The examination had taken years. It had required, among other things, making mistakes, trusting people who did not deserve the trust, losing some money to the people who had been positioned around the estate, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, the death of the patriarch, and the arrival of the unprepared inheritor. She'd been taken advantage of in specific ways that she could document only in retrospect, after she had enough experience to recognize what had happened. The losses had not been catastrophic. The estate was large enough that moderate losses did not destabilize it. But they had been educational in the way that only actual losses are educational. Not theoretically, not from the outside, but from the inside, in the body, in the specific feeling of having been naive about something, and of having paid for the naivety. She learned to read documents herself. This sounds simple. It was not. The documents she needed to read were designed in various subtle ways for people who had been educated in a specific vocabulary that she had not been educated in. The lawyers and the financial advisors who handled these documents used language that was technically precise and practically impenetrable to anyone who had not spent years learning its conventions. She had not spent years learning its conventions. She had spent years learning how to embroider and how to pour tea and how to manage a household and how to navigate the social architecture of her particular corner of New York. She hired a tutor. This was in itself mildly scandalous. A woman of her age and position being tutored in financial and legal language by a man young enough to be her son in her own library for 2 hours every Thursday. The tutoring was not cheap. It was not quick. It required that she accept repeatedly and without too much embarrassment the position of not knowing, of asking basic questions, of being wrong about things she had assumed she understood. She did this for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, she could read her own documents. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is not the stuff of newspaper headlines. It is a woman in her 40s learning to understand the things she had been given and had been managing without fully understanding. It is competence, quietly acquired against genuine obstacles. It is the thing that most of the dramatic stories are missing. The patient, unspectacular work of becoming adequate to the task. There is a kind of heroism in this, a quieter kind than the kind the newspapers preferred, but real. The heroism of staying with the difficult thing rather than abandoning it, of asking the question one more time rather than accepting the incomprehensible answer, of sitting with the document that does not make sense until it does make sense, even if making it make sense takes 3 years of Thursday afternoons. The city around her continued in its way. She watched it from her early morning windows, before the tea was fully made, the light coming up over the buildings to the east and the streets below beginning their transition from nighttime emptiness to daytime busyness. She watched the city changing. She was not afraid of the change the way her father had been afraid of it. She had decided, somewhere in the long process of examination that had occupied her early years of inheriting, that the city's change was not a threat to the estate, but simply a condition of it. The estate existed in the city. The city changed. The management of the estate therefore had to be responsive to the change, had to be capable of adapting rather than simply resistant to anything new. This was a significant difference from her father's approach, significant enough that the estate under her management looked different from the estate under his. Not dramatically different. She was careful. She was not reckless. She did not make changes for the sake of change. But gradually over years the properties were maintained at a higher standard, the tenants were treated with somewhat more basic dignity, the terms of the leases were periodically reviewed and adjusted rather than being held in place forever because change was dangerous. These changes were small. They were invisible in the newspaper accounts because they did not produce scandals. They were visible in the accounts to anyone who looked carefully, in the maintenance costs, in the tenant retention rates, in the slow shift from the anxious, defensive management of a man who feared the world to the competent, attentive management of a woman who had chosen to understand it. She died in her 80s, in a house somewhat smaller than the one she had inherited, having given a substantial portion of the estate away over the course of her management of it. Not all at once, not dramatically. A building here, a donation there, the slow, deliberate redistribution of excess to places where it could actually do something useful. The newspapers did not write about her death. There was nothing scandalous to report. She had lived a responsible life and managed a significant fortune competently, and died having done neither spectacular good nor spectacular harm. She was, by the vocabulary of her era, respectable. She was also, in a way that she did not need anyone to confirm, genuinely herself. That is the thing the newspapers could not report because it has no external evidence. The interior condition of a woman who, over 40 years of managing an inherited empire, had slowly become adequate to the task and then, quietly and without fanfare, had become something more, had become the person she might have been if she had been prepared for the thing she was given, rather than simply handed it and left to figure it out. The self-made woman of the Gilded Age is celebrated in the histories, the immigrant who builds a fortune from nothing, the entrepreneur who sees an opportunity and takes it, the self-made man, and occasionally the self-made woman, whose story is the story of capability meeting circumstance and producing something remarkable. Less celebrated, but equally real, is the woman who inherited and made herself adequate to it, who received the enormous thing and without any model for how to hold it, and against significant resistance to her holding it at all, figured out how to hold it well, who did not build an empire but managed one responsibly, which is a different skill and a different achievement and not a lesser one. These women are in the history. They are in the ledgers and the deeds and the estate records. They are in the buildings that were maintained and the tenants who stayed and the fortunes that did not disappear in a generation through mismanagement or predation. They are just not in the newspaper stories. They did not burn their empires dramatically enough to make the papers. They managed them competently and largely invisibly until the managing was done. The night is very deep now, the breathing very slow. Let the early morning window rest in your mind, the light coming up over the buildings to the east, the tea in the hands, the city beginning its transition from nighttime to daytime, below and outside, indifferent to the woman watching it, carrying on in its own way as cities always do. The woman at the window is not afraid of the change. She's watching it with the full, present attention of someone who has, over years of patient work, come to understand that the world is not hostile, only complex. That complexity, engaged with honestly, is manageable. That the things she's been given, the estate, the fortune, the responsibility, are not traps unless she allows them to become traps. That the only trap is the relationship to the inheritance, not the inheritance itself. She knows this. She worked for the knowing. The light is coming up over the buildings to the east. She turns from the window and picks up the document she was reading last night before she went to bed. She reads 2 pages, carefully making a note in the margin where the language is imprecise. She will ask about this on Thursday. She closes the document, she drinks her tea. The house is beginning to wake around her. The sounds from the kitchen are more distinct now. The day is getting started. She is ready for it. The grand events of any life are always outnumbered by the ordinary ones. This is a fact so obvious that it barely seems worth stating, and yet it is the fact most consistently overlooked in the telling of any story. We remember the dramatic. We tell the dramatic. We organize the stories of the past around the dramatic, the founding, the crisis, the scandal, the resolution. And in doing so, we create a false impression of what any life actually consists of. Most lives, including the most historically significant ones, consist mostly of ordinary days. Days when nothing particularly notable happened and the usual rhythms of the usual activities proceeded without interruption, and the evening came and the person went to sleep, and the morning came and it started again. The women who inherited empires had ordinary days. This is what we will sit with in this act. Not the inheritance ceremony, not the scandal, not the long, sad decline into the fortress mansion. The ordinary day. The morning of a Wednesday in October in a year between the death of the father and the dramatic resolution of the story, whatever form that resolution took. The day when nothing happened except the usual things, and the usual things were enough to constitute a life. The morning begins before the household is properly awake. In the large houses of the Gilded Age, the first hours of the morning belong to the servants, the kitchen staff making the fires and the bread, the housemaids opening the curtains and the downstairs rooms, the scullery girl filling the copper boilers for the day's washing. The lady of the house in most of these establishments did not appear until the household had organized itself sufficiently to receive her. Until the fires were going and the breakfast was underway and the morning room was warm enough to sit in without a shawl. But some of the women we have been thinking about tonight rose before the household was ready, not as a statement, not as a performance of virtue or industry, simply because sleep had released them earlier than expected, and the mind, once active, was unwilling to return to rest, and the quiet of the house in the grey hour before the staff was fully about was a kind of quiet not available at any other time of day. In this quiet they moved through the rooms with the specific freedom of invisibility. No one watching, no one to perform for, just themselves and the house, and the particular quality of the pre-dawn grey coming through the undraped windows of the rooms where the drapes had not yet been pulled. The rooms look different at this hour. The grand scale of them is somehow reduced by the dimness, the proportions more human, the expensive furniture less assertive in its importance. The marble floors, polished to a reflective shine in the daylight, are flat and grey. The chandeliers are dark masses of crystal and brass rather than the cascades of light they become when they are lit. Everything is present but not yet performing, the house at rest. She moves through it slowly, not inspecting, that is the morning's work, the rounds she will make once the household is running, checking the state of things, noting what needs attention. This is something different. This is simply being in the house, in the early morning, before it becomes the place where her responsibilities live. She passes through the drawing room, through the hall, down the corridor to the library. The library is her favourite room in the early morning, for reasons she's never quite articulated, perhaps because the books do not expect anything of her. They sit on their shelves in their leather bindings, patient and present, making no demands. She's not going to read at this hour. But the presence of the books is a kind of company. She sits in the chair by the window. The grey light is strengthening slightly. On the street below, the first of the day's traffic is beginning. A milk cart, the horse's hooves on the cobblestones in the particular rhythm that is one of the sounds of her entire life. She has heard that rhythm since she was a child in this house, the early morning milk cart, and it has become one of those sounds that is so deeply embedded in the experience of home that she would notice its absence long before she would notice its presence. She sits and does not particularly think, or thinks in the way the early morning allows, which is not quite thinking, more like the mind turning things over gently without destination, the way a hand turns over a smooth stone. The properties are there, in the back of the mind, as they always are. The letter from the lawyer about the building on the east side, which she will need to respond to today. The quarterly figures she looked at yesterday evening and which seemed, on first review, to be in order, but which she wants to look at again before she confirms that impression. The small accumulation of the daily management of an enormous estate. These things are there, but they are not urgent at this hour. They will be urgent later. For now they are simply there, the background of a day that has not yet begun. What is in the foreground, at this hour, in this chair, with the milk cart below and the grey light coming through the window, is harder to name. It is something like contentment. Not happiness exactly. The word happiness implies a positive quality, an arrival at something good, and what she feels is more neutral than that, more simply present than that. It is the feeling of being in a place she knows, at a time that is reliably hers, with the day's demands not yet assembled. The feeling of being, for this hour, simply herself, without the modifying pressure of what she's supposed to be. This feeling is ordinary. It arrives with minor variations every morning that she rises before the household. It is not remarkable. It would not be worth mentioning in any account of her life that organised itself around the notable and the dramatic. It is, in every sense of the word, ordinary. And it is, she suspects, on the mornings when she allows herself to think about this, which is not every morning but some, it is the thing she would miss most if it were taken from her, more than the estate, more than the properties, more than the fortune that her father spent his life building and that she has spent her adult life managing. This hour, this chair, this grey light and this milk cart and this quality of being simply present in the house she knows best in the world. The ordinary things are the real inheritance. This is the thought that arrives in the early morning, in the grey hour, in the library with the books that make no demands. Not the buildings and the accounts, not the name that carries social weight in her particular corner of the world, not the specific strategies and the legal structures and the financial instruments that constitute the material substance of the estate. Those things are all part of the inheritance, and she manages them responsibly, and they are real. But the real inheritance, the thing that actually shapes the texture of a day, is this: the habits of life, the morning quiet, the relationship to the house, not as a possession or a responsibility, but as a place, the place where her life has happened, the place she knows with a knowledge that is not intellectual but physical, the way the body knows the familiar. The particular small pleasures that accumulate in a day lived in a place you love and understand. The sound of the milk cart, the smell of the library, the way the afternoon light moves across the east wall of the sitting room, the taste of tea made by someone who knows how you like it, the weight of the account book in your hands. These small things, these ordinary things, they are what the fathers were trying to preserve, though they used very different language and very different methods. They were trying to preserve the life they had built, and the life they had built was made of these small things, and the fortune was the structure that allowed the small things to continue. That is not an entirely wrong understanding of what a fortune is for. Where it went wrong was in the confusing of the structure with the thing it was meant to support, in building the structure so massive and so defended that the small things it was meant to support had no room to exist inside it, in protecting the house so thoroughly that the house could no longer be lived in. The ordinary day, in all its unheroic, undocumented ordinariness, is what the structure is supposed to make possible. The morning quiet, the evening tea, the milk cart on the cobblestones, the grey October light in the library window. These are worth protecting. These are worth the patient, unglamorous work of managing the accounts and reading the documents and sitting with the lawyers on the Thursday afternoons and all the rest of it. These are what the work is for. When the work became its own end, when the management of the estate became the purpose rather than the means, when the preservation of the fortune became the definition of a good life rather than the enabler of one, that is when the ordinary day was lost. The Wendell sisters lost the ordinary day so thoroughly that by the end they had no ordinary days at all. Only the ritual of management, repeated without end in rooms that smelled of the newspapers they had never read, in a house that had become a vault rather than a home. The ordinary day had leaked out year by year until there was nothing left but the guarding. This is the tragedy we have been circling all night, not the loss of the fortune. The fortune dispersed as all fortunes eventually disperse, and the world continued. The tragedy is the loss of the ordinary day, the milk cart on the cobblestones, the morning quiet in the library, the grey light and the smooth stone turning in the hand of the mind that is not quite thinking. These things, which cost nothing and require only the willingness to be present in them, were lost first. Everything else followed. We are near the end of the night now. The deep hours are behind us. Something in the quality of the dark has changed. The subtle shift that precedes the dawn, the slight adjustment in the temperature of the air, the particular quality of silence that is different from the earlier silence, more expectant, waiting for the morning to arrive. The story has found its way to this moment as stories do, not by arriving at a destination. The best stories do not arrive at destinations. They arrive at a quality of presence, a sense of having been somewhere real, in the company of something true. We have been in the company of women tonight, in the large houses and the smaller ones, in the library chairs and the parlour chairs and the afternoon sitting rooms, and the factory yards and the boarding houses and the trains going west, in the morning quiet before the household wakes, and in the very late hours after the household has gone to sleep, in the places and the hours that history does not usually record. We have tried to attend, to be present in the ordinariness of lives that were shaped by extraordinary circumstances, to hear the voice behind the account book, to see the hands slightly open at the sides, in the photograph where everyone else's hands are folded. The milk cart is on the cobblestones below the library window. The grey October light is coming through the glass. The books are on their shelves, patient and present, making no demands. And the woman in the chair is here. Still here. Quietly, entirely here. There is a question worth sitting with in the penultimate act of this long night. After all the burning, after the fortunes given away and the empires dissolved and the great houses emptied and the names dispersed into the general silence of historical forgetting, after all of that, what was built? Not rebuilt, not reconstructed, built new, created in the space that the burning made. This is the question that the dramatic narrative, the cautionary tale, the newspaper story always skips. It stops at the burning. It tells us what was lost and sometimes why it was lost, and what the loss meant for the people who experienced it. But it does not follow the space that the loss opened into. It does not ask what grew in the cleared ground. Let us ask it. In the most literal sense, the Gilded Age properties that were sold and redeveloped produced new buildings. The mansion at 739 Fifth Avenue became an office tower. The tenement blocks became something else, different buildings, some of them better and some of them worse, all of them inhabited by different people with different stories. The economic value of the land moved through the economy in the usual way, creating jobs and incomes and the downstream effects of capital that moved rather than capital that stood still. This is not nothing, it is in fact quite a lot. The city that exists in the 21st century is partly built on the capital that moved when the Gilded Age empires dispersed. The buildings that stand on the sites where the old mansion stood are inhabited by people who have no idea that a fortune once lived and died on that particular ground. Their ordinary days are happening in the space that the burning made. But that is the literal sense, and the literal sense is only part of what we are asking. In the human sense, in the interior sense, what was built in the space the burning made? For the women who did the burning, sometimes very little. The burning often came at the end, in the late years of a life that had been organised around the fortress. There was not much time left after the burning to build in the cleared space. The fortune was given away in her 60s, and she died in her 70s, and the decade in between was valuable but brief. She did things in that decade that she had not done before. She travelled. She had conversations. She attended to friendships she had allowed to become ceremonial, and found that, tended carefully, they became real again. She read things that were not on the approved list, because there was no longer an approved list, and the reading was vivid in a way that reading had not been since she was young, and allowed herself to be fully absorbed by a book. These are not small things. A decade of genuine living is not nothing. But the larger building, the building that the burning made possible in ways that extended beyond the woman who did the burning, this happened in the next generation, in the people who came after, in the inheritors of the new, smaller, questioned fortune rather than the old, vast, unquestioned one. There are women in the first decades of the 20th century, the daughters and nieces and granddaughters of the Gilded Age heiresses, the women who came of age in a world that was already different from the world their mothers and aunts had inhabited, who built things, not mansions, not empires, things that were useful and real and that reflected their own judgment about what was worth building. The settlement houses, funded partly by the fortunes that had been redistributed in the previous generation, the schools and the clinics and the organizations that were experimenting with new approaches to the problems that had always existed, but that the Gilded Age's elaborate machinery of social maintenance had managed to keep at a comfortable distance from the very wealthy. The professional lives, the women who went into medicine or law or social work or education, who built careers rather than managing inheritances, who found in the work itself the satisfaction that the managed fortune never quite provided. These women are the building that happened after the burning. They were not always conscious of the connection. They did not always know that their freedom to make these choices was partly the legacy of a grandmother's unconventional philanthropy or a great-aunt's decision to sell the factory rather than simply continuing to own it. The connections were obscured by time and by the general tendency of families not to examine their own histories too carefully. But the connection was there. The loosened grip passed forward through a generation. The interrupted transmission of the old psychology, the slightly more open-handed inheritance, the slightly less fortress-like family house, the slightly less categorical instruction that the world was hostile and the fortune was the only protection against it. These slight differences compounded. They do not look dramatic from the inside, from the perspective of the daughter or granddaughter who simply grew up in a household that was somewhat less controlled than her grandmother's had been. From the outside, over time, they produced women who were somewhat more able to take the world as it actually was, somewhat more capable of imagining a range of possible futures, somewhat less paralysed by the specific fear that the fortune would be taken if they did not guard it every moment. Somewhat. The word is modest because the reality was modest. These were incremental changes, not revolutions. They produced somewhat different people, not entirely different ones. The family psychology did not disappear in a generation. It persisted, modified and attenuated but persistent, showing up in certain reflexes and certain assumptions and certain characteristic ways of reacting to situations that felt threatening. But somewhat is not nothing. Somewhat is over time everything. The building that happens after the burning is usually not visible in the individual story. It is visible in the aggregate, in the pattern across several generations, in the slow shift from the fortress to the open house, from the hoarding to the giving, from the management of an empire to the making of a life. Let's think for a moment about what an open house looks like. Not the physical description. Any architect can tell you what it looks like structurally. The feeling of it. The quality of being inside a house that is genuinely open to the world rather than organised against it. The door that opens regularly, that admits people who are not scrutinised for threat before they cross the threshold. The rooms that are used, that are inhabited and changed and adapted and sometimes slightly damaged by use in the way that any genuinely lived-in space is changed and sometimes damaged. The smell of a house that is alive, the cooking and the people and the plants that someone is keeping, and the shoes by the door and the coat thrown over the chair rather than hanging precisely on its designated hook. This is what the burning builds eventually, not a monument to the fortune, not a vault, a house. The women who inherited empires and burned them, who gave away the mansions and dispersed the fortunes and interrupted the transmission of the fortress psychology, they were building, though the building was not always what they would have called it. They were building the possibility of a house that was a house again rather than a cage. This is the inheritance worth having, not the fortune, not the name, the open door. The deep night is passing now. The dark has that quality it takes on in the final hours before dawn, softer, more yielding, as if the darkness itself is beginning to release its hold on the night and preparing to step back and let the light through. In a room somewhere, in a city that exists in the early 21st century, in a building that stands on ground where a Gilded Age mansion once stood, someone is asleep. They do not know about the mansion. They do not know about the woman who built it or the daughters who inherited it, or the specific history of fear and control and careful management and eventual dissolution that accumulated on that ground over the course of a few generations and then dispersed into the general air of the city. They are simply asleep, in a room, in a city, on ground that has held many stories, as all ground has, and that holds them now with equal impartiality, the fortunes and the burning and the building and the long, patient ordinary days of the women who move through it all. The ground holds all of it. The story settles into the ground now, gently like the snow that settles on the city, covering the cobblestones and the office towers and the parks with their struggling trees, making everything briefly equal under the white. The burning happened, the holding happened, the giving away happened, the long afternoons happened, the milk cart on the cobblestones happened. All of it is here, in the ground, in the quality of the air of this late night, in the story that has held you through the hours. And now the story is almost done. Let it settle. Let it rest in the ground the way all the stories rest that came before this one, and will rest all the stories that come after. The night is soft now. The dawn is somewhere nearby, patient and unhurried, waiting for the right moment to begin. Sleep is nearby too. You can feel it if you are very still. A quality of heaviness in the body, a loosening in the mind, a willingness to let the story be what it has been rather than continuing to hold it at tension. Let it go. The story is good. The story will be here when you come back to it. Let it go. There is always a last light left on in a house. Not forgotten, exactly. Left deliberately. The light at the end of the hallway left on in case someone needs to navigate in the night. The lamp in the kitchen window, which has always been left on, and which no one has ever made a definitive decision to stop leaving on, and so it continues year after year, a small persistent illumination that no one is particularly responsible for, but that is always there. The last light in the great houses of the Gilded Age burned for a long time after the people who had lit it were gone. Not literally. Literally, when the last sister died and the estate proceedings began, all the lights went out very quickly. The lawyers arrived, the inventories were taken, the keys were transferred. Whatever remained of the lighting arrangements was extinguished along with everything else, and the house waited in darkness for whatever came next. But in the other sense, in the sense that matters more than the literal one, the light continued. In the story that persisted, in the way certain people in certain later generations would hear the name and feel something, recognition, or unease, or the particular quality of a story that has been told so many times it has become part of the furniture of a culture's self-understanding. In the newspaper accounts that got filed and refiled and eventually digitized and made searchable, so that anyone curious enough to look could find the details. In the accounts and the ledgers that survived in archives, patient and precise and silent about everything except the numbers, but available for anyone willing to learn to read them. The light continued in the way that any significant story continues, by being told, by being examined, by being returned to in different eras and with different questions, by people who find in it something that is still alive, still relevant, still doing something that stories do when they are genuinely worth telling. We have been returning to it tonight. The women of the great Gilded Age houses left their lights burning in the most durable way available to any human life, in the stories that survive them, not because they intended to leave those lights. The women who lived most privately, who managed their affairs most carefully from inside the fortress, who left the least external record. These women did not particularly intend to be remembered. They intended, if anything, to be left alone, to manage the estate and protect the fortune, and avoid the kind of visibility that led to the kind of attention, that led to the kind of danger they had been trained since childhood to fear. Their intentions in this regard were not honoured. They became visible in the most complete and ironic way possible, precisely because they tried so hard not to be. The woman who walled herself in behind the newspapers and the locked doors and the ritual management of the accounts became, at the moment of her death, the most visible woman in New York. The woman who never gave the newspapers anything worth printing gave them, in the end, more than they could process. This is not a lesson, it is just a fact. The attempts to be invisible sometimes produce the most lasting visibility. The fortress, in collapsing, makes more noise than the open house. But there is something else worth sitting with about the light in the window, something that has nothing to do with the dramatic endings and the newspaper accounts and the spectacular reversals of intention that make for good historical anecdote. Think of the ordinary light, the lamp in the kitchen that no one made a decision to leave on but that is always there, the light that no one is responsible for but that burns steadily through the night, illuminating the familiar objects of the familiar room, waiting for whoever might need it. In the great houses there was always ordinary light. Alongside the managed performance of the grand spaces, the ballrooms lit for occasions that rarely occurred, the formal dining rooms illuminated for dinners where the conversation followed the same careful grooves. Alongside all of that, there was the ordinary light of ordinary living, the candle in the bedroom, the lamp by the chair where someone sat in the evening and read or sewed or simply sat, the kitchen light that burned when the cook was working and sometimes burned on long after the cook had gone home, because someone had forgotten to extinguish it, and the small waste of light did not seem worth going back down to remedy. That ordinary light is the one we are sitting with now in these final acts of the night, the light that does not perform, the light that is simply there because some basic human need requires it. The women who lived inside the great houses needed that light the same way anyone needs it, not the chandelier light, not the formal illumination of the spaces designed to impress, the small steady light that makes it possible to navigate, to read, to see the face of the person you're talking to find your way through the dark hall to the place where the morning will begin. In the hardest years, in the years when the fortress was most completely sealed and the isolation most total and the paranoia most consuming, this was what remained. The ordinary light, the small, persistent, undramatic illumination of daily life, the candle that burned through the night in the room where the last sister sat with her ledgers and her newspapers and her memories of the people who had been there before her. It is not enough, you might say. Of course it is not enough. A candle in a room full of newspapers, in a house full of decay, in a life that has been reduced to the ritual management of something it can no longer really hold. A candle in that room is not enough. It does not redeem the situation. It does not make the isolation beautiful or the paranoia meaningful or the waste of a life into something that ought to have happened. But it is not nothing. The candle burns. The woman reads. The night passes as all nights pass. And there is, in the burning of the candle and the reading and the passing of the night, something that is not reducible to the tragedy of the situation, something that is simply the stubborn persistence of a human life in circumstances that do not support it, the candle burning because it has always burned, the reading because reading is what she has always done in the evenings, before the newspapers took over, when the books were still accessible, the night passing because that is what nights do, regardless of the quality of the life they are passing through. This persistence, this unremarkable, unresolved, not enough but not nothing persistence, this is the thing we are left with in the end by the stories of the Gilded Age heiresses. Not a moral, not a lesson, not an inspiring example of what a woman can accomplish, or a cautionary tale about what excessive wealth produces. Just the stubborn, ordinary persistence of human life, in whatever circumstances it finds itself. The candle burning, the hand turning the page, the night passing. There are other houses in other centuries with their own ordinary lights burning through their own particular nights. The kitchen lamp in the farmhouse in Iowa, the reading light in the apartment in Brooklyn, the night light in the hallway of the house with children in it, the bedside lamp in the room where someone is too awake to sleep and not awake enough to do anything purposeful with the wakefulness. These lights are all the same light, in the only way that matters. They are the small, persistent illumination of a human life that is continuing, regardless of what that life has been and what it has not been, into another hour, another day, another turn of the world that is always the same world and always somehow different. The light in the window, always the light in the window. We're going to come back to that light in the final act. We're going to let it rest there, burning quietly, while we gather the last of the night's materials together. But for now, let it just be there, not requiring anything, not performing anything, just burning, as it has always burned, in the particular way of things that persist without anyone quite deciding that they should. The ordinary light, the faithful, unheroic, undocumented, entirely necessary ordinary light. We are nearly at the end of this long telling. The night has moved through its arc and is now in the space between the deep dark and the first pale suggestion of what comes next. This is the space where sleep lives, or where sleep is available if you allow yourself to enter it, if you can let the last of the day's thinking dissolve into the general softness of the pre-dawn. The stories have been told. Not all of them. No night is long enough for all the stories, but enough of them. Enough to give a sense of the shape of the thing, the particular texture of these women's lives, the complicated truth of what it meant to inherit an empire and to be shaped by the inheriting, and to make choices inside the shaping and to live, as best one could, with the results of those choices. It is enough. The story is enough. Let it be enough. The light in the windows burning. The city outside is beginning very slowly its transition from one day to the next. The room you're in is quiet. The body is very heavy. The mind is loosening its last grip on the things it was holding. Let them go. When an estate is settled, an inventory is taken. This is the work of a practical morning, or several practical mornings. The lawyers and the estate agents move through the rooms with their clipboards and their professional eyes, cataloguing what is there. The furniture, by piece and by condition. The artwork, by subject and approximate value. The books, by shelf and by category. The household goods, the linens and the silver, and the kitchen equipment, and the 100 small objects that constitute the material fabric of a household, all of it noted, assessed, assigned a value, entered into the official record that will guide the distribution of the estate. The inventory is thorough. The inventory is accurate within the limits of the assessor's knowledge and the time available. The inventory captures everything that can be valued. What the inventory cannot capture is the meaning. The silver candelabra has a market value. It does not have in the inventory the story of where it came from. The wedding gift, perhaps, from someone long dead, or the purchase made on a particular day in a particular shop for reasons that had nothing to do with the market value of silver candelabras. The books on the shelf have a value by weight and by condition, and by the occasional presence of a rare edition. They do not have in the inventory the story of which of them were read and which were left unread and which were read so many times the spines have cracked and which have a specific page dog-eared because a particular sentence stopped the reader in a particular year on a particular afternoon. The inventory takes the what. The why and the who and the when are not its business. This is why we have been sitting with these stories all night, not to add to the inventory. The inventories are complete. The estates are documented. The financial histories of the Gilded Age fortunes have been reconstructed with a thoroughness that would have appalled the people who built those fortunes and who went to considerable lengths to obscure them. We have been sitting with the stories because the stories are what the inventory cannot capture, the meaning behind the object, the life behind the ledger, the woman behind the account book. Let us do, in these final acts, something like a different kind of inventory, not the estate inventory, the interior inventory, not the silver and the artwork and the books, the things that matter differently. The woman who inherited the empire. What she carried. We have touched on many of these things tonight in various acts in various rooms with various women. Let us gather them together now in this late hour, in the way that you gather the things that matter when you are deciding what to take with you and what to leave behind. She carried the grief of the unlived life. This was the first and most persistent thing, the specific grief of a person who knows, not abstractly but in the body, what it would have felt like to be allowed to want more than was permitted. The man turned away at the door, the travel never taken, the conversation that would have led somewhere genuinely interesting, but that was redirected politely and firmly back into the approved channels. The grief was not dramatic. It was ambient. It was the background quality of a life lived with the windows partly closed. She carried the knowledge of what she was managing. She knew, in ways she was not always allowed to acknowledge in the presence of others, exactly what she was doing. The estate management that she had been told was beyond her comprehension was, in fact, comprehensible. Difficult and requiring effort, but comprehensible. She had comprehended it, and she managed it well, and no one thanked her for the managing or even particularly noticed that it was happening. This knowledge, of her own competence, unacknowledged, was something she carried quietly, neither displaying it nor abandoning it. She carried the love for the house. This is perhaps the most complicated thing on the interior inventory, because the house was also the cage, and the love for the cage is not a simple emotion. But it was real. The house was the place where her life had happened. It was the place she knew most completely, with a knowledge that was not intellectual but physical. The body's knowledge of familiar space, of the specific feel of the floorboards underfoot in the hallway, of the way the door to the library needs to be lifted slightly to open smoothly, of the smell of the rooms at different times of day and different seasons of the year. This love was not chosen. It had accumulated, the way all the deep loves accumulate without particular intention, simply through the long habitation of a place. She carried the relationship to her father, not a simple relationship, not a simple love, though love was part of it. The love was complicated by the understanding of what he had done to her, by the awareness, however dimly she permitted herself to have it, that the life she was living was partly a function of choices he had made on her behalf, before she was old enough to have choices of her own. The love and the complicated by knowledge coexisted in the way that all complicated loves coexist. Not resolved, not dissolved, just there, both present, both real. She carried the question. We have returned to this many times tonight, and we return to it now because it never leaves. The question of what the fortune was for. The question of what any of the careful management and the responsible stewardship and the long patient work of maintaining the estate was supposed to produce. She did not always ask this question consciously, but she carried it. It was there in the long afternoons, in the evening hours, in the early mornings before the household was awake, always just below the surface of the daily management, always waiting. She carried finally a version of hope. This is the most surprising item on the interior inventory, perhaps, for a woman who lived inside the constraints we have been describing. But it was there. The hope did not require a specific object. It was not hope for a particular thing or a particular outcome. It was hope in the more general sense, the sense that refuses to entirely close the door on the possibility that something might be different, that the morning might bring something, that the day might contain some small thing worth noticing, that the life, however shaped by forces outside her control, was still, in some essential way, hers. This hope is fragile and important. It is the thing that kept the candle burning when everything else had been extinguished. It is the light in the window. We do not know if she found what she was hoping for. The interior inventories are not documented. We have the account books and the deeds and the estate records and the occasional newspaper mention. but we do not have the record of what was hoped for and whether it arrived. We have the hope itself, implied by the fact of the continuing. The woman who continued, who rose each morning and managed the estate and sat in the afternoon light and asked the question and carried the grief and loved the house and felt the complicated love for the father and kept the small object in the drawer. This woman was hoping, not demonstrably, not in any way the inventory could capture, but hoping nonetheless. That hope is part of the inventory. The last and most important item. The inventory is complete. Let it rest now, the cataloguing is done, the items have been noted and their value such as it is assessed. What is left after the inventory is the space the items occupied, the room from which they have been removed, the empty shelf where the books were, the bare floor where the rug was, the square of slightly brighter wall where the painting hung. The absence, the space. And the light still coming through the window. Still coming through, patient and indifferent, the way light comes through windows regardless of what has happened in the rooms behind them. We are almost at the last thing now. The breathing is very slow, the body has grown very still, the mind has loosened most of its holdings and is turning gently toward the place where the day's thoughts dissolve and the sleeping begins. The story has one more act, the last one, the brief one, the one that returns to the beginning. Let the inventory dissolve, let the rooms empty, let the light come through. The last act is waiting. In a museum somewhere, the exact location matters less than the fact of the existence. There is a small cardboard box with faded printing. It is not an impressive object. In any other context, it would be garbage. A box that once held crackers, the kind of box that would have been found in any kitchen of its era, in any household regardless of its means. Cardboard, plain. The printing on the sides faded past legibility. Inside this box, when it was found, there was money. Not a great deal of money in the context of the estate. A few $1,000s in cash and securities, folded and compressed into the interior of a cracker box on a kitchen shelf, hidden there and forgotten, or hidden there and remembered but never retrieved, which is a different kind of forgetting. The kind that happens when a person has lost track of the difference between what is hidden and what is gone. The box is in a museum now, behind glass, with a small placard that explains its significance. Most people walk past it without stopping. It is, to the casual eye, just a box, an artifact of an era when cardboard was made differently, and crackers were packaged differently, and people kept their things in different ways. But for people who know the story, who have heard the story in whatever form they encountered it, the box is something else. It is the question. Not a specific question. Not a question with a grammar and a sentence structure and a particular set of words. It is the question in the form that questions sometimes take when they have been asked too many times, and the asking has worn them down to something prior to language, the question that underlies all the other questions, the question that all the others are trying to get at. The box on the shelf, the fortune in the box, the woman who put it there, the life she lived around it. What are you holding on to? We have been sitting with this question all night, in various rooms with various women, in various acts of the long story. We have not resolved it. We were never going to resolve it. Some questions are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be carried, to be taken into the ordinary days and the long afternoons and the early mornings before the household is awake, and to be there in the background, patient and persistent, available when the ordinary things are not filling up the whole of the attention. What are you holding on to? For the women of the Gilded Age great houses, the answer was most often the fortune, the specific material embodiment of everything that had been built and everything that had been sacrificed to build it. The buildings and the accounts and the carefully maintained legal structure that converted the physical reality of Manhattan real estate into the stream of income that kept the household running. This is what they were holding on to. But underneath the fortune, what were they holding on to? This is the question the cracker box actually asks. Not about the money is just the object in the box. About the relationship to the money. The specific emotional logic that put it in the box in the first place and left it there. The fear. The specific, particular, entirely human fear of losing what you have that, when it becomes absolute and unmanaged and unquestioned, produces a woman alone in a mansion full of newspapers, afraid to let the repairman in, afraid to answer the door, afraid to spend any of the millions of dollars at her disposal on the ordinary necessities of a decent life. What was she holding on to, really? Not the money. The money was the medium. She was holding on to safety. To the specific feeling of safety that her father's relentless accumulation had been designed to produce, and had produced, for him, in a specific historical moment, in the specific circumstances of a man who had come from nothing, and who knew, in his body, what it felt like to have nothing. The safety was real. The fortune had provided it. The logic was sound. What got lost in the transmission was the distinction between the medium and the end, between the money and the safety, between the thing that provided the feeling and the feeling itself. The money was never the point. The feeling of safety was the point, and the money accumulated past the point where it could actually produce that feeling, past the point where any reasonable person could look at the fortune and say, yes, we are safe now, we have more than enough. The money beyond that point was not producing safety anymore, it was just more money. And the fear that drove the accumulation was not being addressed by the accumulation. It was just growing, feeding on itself, producing more fear rather than more safety. Because no amount of money was ever going to be enough to satisfy a fear that was not, at its root, about money. The fear was about loss, the original loss, long before the money, the specific shape of a specific life that was organized around the prevention of the original loss, the poverty and the powerlessness, and the specific vulnerability of a person who has nothing in a world that does not care whether you have nothing or not. The fortune was the answer to that fear, but the fortune was also the inheritance of the fear, and the inheritance of the fear was what passed from father to daughters. The fortune passed too, but the fortune was the smaller part. The fear was the larger part. The fear was what organized the lives. The fortune was just the material in which the fear expressed itself. This is what the cracker box contains, not the money, the fear. And the question the box asks, the question that persists past the museum placard and the casual glance of the person who walks by without stopping, is not really about the money either. It is, how did this happen? How does a fear, reasonable and human and understandable in its origins, become an inheritance? How does the protection designed for one person become the cage of the next? How does the house built for safety become the house that makes safety impossible? These are not questions about the Gilded Age, they are questions about now, about every inheritance, of money, of psychology, of fear, of the specific ways that families organize themselves around the things they are most afraid of losing. Every family has a cracker box, not always literally, but the equivalent. The thing that is being protected more than it needs to be protected, by someone who learned to protect it from someone who had good reasons to protect it, and who cannot quite distinguish the good reasons from the fear that has outlasted the reasons. The cracker box asks, do you know what you are protecting? Do you know why? Do you know whether the protection is still serving the purpose it was designed to serve, or whether it has become its own purpose, the management of the protection, organized around itself, no longer in service of anything except the continuation of the management? These are good questions. They are uncomfortable questions. They are the kind of questions that are easier to walk past without stopping, the way most people walk past the cracker box in the museum. But they are worth stopping for. Not tonight, necessarily. Tonight is for sleep, for the deep rest that comes after a long telling and a long listening. Tonight is for letting the story do whatever stories do when they have been taken in and allowed to settle. That settling is important. It happens in the body, not the mind, and it requires sleep to complete. But tomorrow, or the day after, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day, in the long afternoon with the cooling tea and the moving light, in the early morning before the household is fully awake, sometime in the regular flow of the regular days, when the story has settled into the background where it lives, the question will surface. And when it does, it will be worth sitting with. What are you holding on to? And is it worth your life? The second question is the one the Wendell sisters could not answer, because they never asked the first. The first question was always there, patient and persistent in the afternoon light, and the evening silence and the early morning before the milk cart came. They moved around it the way they moved around the towers of newspapers, carefully, without looking directly at it, navigating the narrow pathways between the accumulations of a life organized around not asking. They could not ask. They had been taught not to ask. The asking was the thing that led to the loosening, and the loosening was the thing that led to the loss, and the loss was the thing that must not happen, the thing around which the entire architecture of their lives had been constructed. But the architecture is gone now. The mansion is gone. The newspapers are gone. The fortune is dispersed, and the sisters are gone, and the city is built on the site of the fortress, and forgotten that there was ever a fortress there. What remains is the question. Floating in the air of this late night, patient, not requiring anything, not demanding an answer, just present, the way the best questions are present, quietly, persistently, available when you are ready for them, and not intruding when you are not. What are you holding on to? Let it float there, in the air of the room you are in the particular dark of this particular late hour, gentle and patient and not requiring anything of the sleeping body or the loosening mind. It will be there tomorrow. It will be there in all the ordinary days that follow this night. The question is in no hurry. The night holds everything. This is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. The night, in the literal sense of the hours between the settling of one day and the rising of the next, holds everything that has been thought and felt and done and undone and considered and set aside and decided and reconsidered. It holds the day's accumulation. It holds the longer accumulation of all the days before, the sediment of a life settling into whatever shape it settles into when the deliberate management of the waking hours releases its grip. The night holds the women we have been sitting with tonight, holds them in the way that all the past is held, not gone, not fixed, but present in a particular way, accessible to anyone who knows where and how to look. We have been looking all night, and what we have found is what is always found when we look at the past with genuine attention and genuine patience, not the dramatic narrative, not the neat moral, not the cautionary tale or the inspiring example, but the texture, the specific irreducible texture of lives that were really lived, in real circumstances, by real women who wanted things and feared things and managed things and made choices and lived inside their choices and sometimes, in small ways and large, found moments of genuine presence in the midst of everything else. Those moments are what the night holds. Let us gather them in this act before the story ends. The moment of the early morning cup of tea, made in the quiet kitchen before the household woke, when the house was briefly just a house, and not a performance or a management challenge or a vault or a cage. The moment of the daughter at the factory yard asking her question with genuine curiosity. The question that opened the door that changed what was possible. The moment of the woman at the window, in the long afternoon, watching the city with the full unhurried attention of someone who has, at last, decided to actually see. The moment of the giving, the donation made quietly without credit, the money entering the world in a new form, the settlement house getting its roof repaired, the winter becoming slightly less cold for the people inside it. The moment of the portrait in the drawer, the small private keeping of the evidence of a life that was larger than the account books showed. The moment of the train moving westward, and the woman at the window with nowhere to be, watching the landscape change with the specific freedom of someone who has completed the work she was given and is now, at last, simply travelling. These moments are in the night, held carefully in the way the night holds things, without organising them into narrative, without forcing them into lessons, just holding them, present and real, in the general darkness that is also a general openness. The night is generous in this way. It does not sort. It does not judge. It does not distinguish between the dramatic and the ordinary, between the historically significant and the entirely private. It holds the moment of the daughter at the factory yard and the moment of the woman making tea with equal attention, equal care. This is the night's particular wisdom, the democracy of the dark. All of it held, all of it equal in the holding. In the morning, in the particular morning that will follow this particular night, the morning that exists already in the hours ahead, patient and bright and entirely indifferent to whether you are ready for it. In that morning, things will be sorted again. The day will begin, the obligations will reassemble, the light will impose its hierarchies, its distinctions between what matters more and what matters less, its insistence on the difference between the significant and the trivial. The morning is good, the morning is necessary, the mornings are where the work gets done. But the night is good too. The night, with its democracy and its patience and its willingness to hold everything without sorting it, is its own kind of necessary. The night is where the work of the self gets done. The slower, quieter work of integrating what the day has produced, of letting the sediment settle, of allowing the story to find its shape without forcing it into a shape. We have been in the night all night, and now the night is nearly done. Not gone. The dark outside is still dark. The dawn is still an hour away, or perhaps a little less, the particular estimation of remaining dark that you make with your body, rather than your eyes in the deep hours. Still dark, still the night's territory, still the space where the stories live without being required to explain themselves. But nearly done. The story has been told, not all of it. No story ever contains all of it, and we have been selective, as all stories are selective, choosing these rooms and these women and these moments, rather than the infinite other rooms and women and moments that existed in the same era and the same city. We have been partial, in every sense of that word. And yet, partial as it is, the story has been enough to do what stories do when they are worth telling. It has created, in the space between the telling and the listening, a kind of presence, a sense of having been somewhere that is not here, a slight expansion of the available world. This is the gift of the night and the story together. The slight expansion. The world you wake into tomorrow will be, in small but real ways, larger than the world you were in this morning. Not because the story added information, it adds some information, historical details and human textures, and the particular geometry of lives lived in specific circumstances, but information is not the point. Because the story exercised the capacity for attention, for sitting with, for staying in a room with a complicated thing rather than moving quickly past it. That capacity exercised grows, the way any muscle grows, not dramatically, not all at once, but with use and over time. The capacity for attention exercised in the quiet of a late night, in the company of a story, in the specific receptivity of the body that is moving towards sleep. This is not nothing, this is practice. Practice for all the other moments of attention that the ordinary days will require. The slight expansion. Take it with you into the morning. Not as cargo, not as something to be managed or preserved or protected, just as a quality of presence that is a little larger than it was, a little more able to sit with what is complicated without requiring it to resolve, a little more comfortable in the company of questions that do not have answers. The women of the great houses would have recognized this, the ones who asked the question in the afternoon, who sat with the grief in the evening, who rose early and made tea in the quiet kitchen and looked at the city from the window before the performance began. These women were practicing this capacity in the only hours and places available to them. They were expanding their presence quietly, persistently, against the specific constraints of their specific lives. We are not so different from them. The constraints are different. The fortunes are different, if there are fortunes. The houses are different. But the same basic human work is happening in the ordinary days and the long afternoons and the early mornings and the late nights, the work of becoming present, of being increasingly actually here. The night holds all of this too. Holds it without sorting it into a hierarchy of what matters more and what matters less. Everything held, everyone held. The woman in the crackerbox mansion, and the woman on the train going west, and the woman making tea in the quiet kitchen, and the woman in the drawer with the portrait. All held. All equally real, all part of the enormous, undifferentiated, infinitely patient holding of the dark. And in the room you're in the particular quiet of this particular late hour, you are held too. Not by the story exactly, by the night. The same night that holds everything. The same dark that has been here for as long as there have been people to need it. The same patient darkness that received the Gilded Age and the women who lived in it, and the fortunes they inherited, and the lives they lived around those fortunes, and that receives now, without distinction, the story of those women and the person who has been listening to the story through this long and generous night. The night holds it all, and now it is time to let it hold you. The story is done. The questions are present and patient and asking nothing. The body is very heavy. The mind has let most of its holdings go. The light in the window is still burning. It was always there. It will be there when you wake. Sleep. The story has found its end. Or the place where it rests, at least. Stories like these do not end in the way that accounts balance, with a final figure and a line drawn beneath it. They settle, like snow settling on a city that has already seen many winters, like the house at the end of the day when everyone has gone to their rooms and the lamps are turned low and the only sound is the particular sound of a building breathing. You are in your room now. The streets outside are quiet. Whatever city, whatever night, whatever particular configuration of walls and windows and the specific quality of dark that belongs to this hour and this place. The women of the great houses are gone back into the silence from which this night drew them. The fortunes are dispersed. The afternoon light has moved on. What remains is this: the room you are in, the weight of the body resting, the mind having released the last of the day's considerations, letting them go one by one into the general quiet of the late hour. The cracker box is empty. The question floats in the air like a breath. The window holds a single light. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you could sit down for an afternoon tea with one of the women from tonight's story, the heiress who gave her fortune quietly away, the one who held on until the end, the woman on the train going west, or the one who made tea alone in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, which would you choose, and what one thing would you most want to ask her? Leave your answer in the comments.